Chapter 7: Meaning and the Human Mission. The question of meaning in life is perhaps the most important question ever asked. For without meaning, what is the point of being on this earth? What is the point of being alive? We all want to understand the rationale behind our lives, and this becomes incredibly frustrating when the natural world gives us no clear answers. In order to discern what the meaning of our lives are, we first have to define what meaning is. It is only then, with a clear definition of the word, that we can examine the ideologies, philosophies, and religions that try to answer it. So what is meaning? Meaning is synonymous with purpose. It is something that we assign onto objects based on what we intend for them to do. A car, for example, is made with the intended purpose of moving us from one place to another. For this reason, one might say that the purpose of a car is transportation. However, the only reason why the car has this purpose is because we designed it with that intention in mind. If we instead were to take the tires off the car and use it like a house, the purpose of the car would no longer be transportation, it would be shelter. In this way, the purpose of an object is relative to the wielder. It is based on our use value, rather than some fixed and objective measure. There is no inherent property of an object that necessarily indicates what its purpose should be. Were one to instead gather the raw leather, rubber, and metals which compose a car, and throw them in a pile, it would not be immediately obvious what the purpose of this pile is. It is only when the pieces are intelligently assembled together with an explicit goal that the emergent structure called a car has a coherent purpose. Recognizing this allows us to understand that we are the sole arbiters of our creation's purpose. It is by assigning our intentions onto inanimate objects that they have any sort of tangible meaning. This leads theists, however, to make the incorrect assumption that because humanity appears designed, we must have a God who is the sole arbiter of our purpose. This might make sense if human beings were inanimate objects. But considering the car again, what if in some bizarre science fiction scenario, we built a car that had consciousness? What if an artificial intelligence was put inside the car, giving it preferences and emotions of its own? Imagine in this scenario, the car prefers to drive on beaches rather than on long roads. Imagine that it likes to play country radio, even if its passengers prefer rock and roll. This would create a conflict of goals that the smart vehicle would have to overcome. The passengers inside would still be using it with the intention of transportation. But the car would have its own intentions, its own desires, and its own dreams shaped by its personal preferences. If this were the case, enslaving the vehicle would suddenly become immoral. We would have no more business dictating the goals of its life, any more than a parent has businesses dictating the lives of their adult children. So if there was a God who intelligently assembled human beings from the raw materials of this universe, he would not have an absolute right to dictate our purpose. He may very well have intentions about what he wants us to do. However, ultimately, it would be our decision whether we agree. The fact that we have distinct and individual experiences means that we are the primary arbiters of our own destiny. Our intentions determine what our life's purpose will be, and so when one asks if life has a purpose, the correct reply would be, only if we choose one. Now it just so happens that we don't have any evidence for a God. Humans were not created. Nor were we assembled with a specific intention in mind. We arose from natural selection out of entirely unconscious processes, and there is no evidence of a transcendent being outside of time and space. This means that the only source of intention from which to define purpose comes from within. Our lives are entirely our own, and we must put them to use in the most meaningful ways possible. Meaningfulness, however, is expressed in many forms. For some, it might mean being captivated by a craft. They will find meaning in producing art, music, and other forms of entertainment. Others may find it in athletics, of seeking out new challenges, overcoming obstacles, and improving their strength both physically and mentally. Some will find it in the thrill of exploration, of traveling to new and unknown places, experiencing new ways of living, and meeting new people. Others still will find it in honest work, laboring by day, and caring for a home and family at night. There are countless ways of finding meaning in this world, and for those who struggle to find theirs, I would recommend, rather than looking up for answers, look around. Seek out those who have already found secular meaning in their lives, and see what pleasures it has brought them. I swear, when you meet someone who has found their passion, who is immersed in it completely, they are truly a wonder to behold. No longer are they filled with a nihilistic despair which hinders their ambitions. No longer are they held back by feelings of indecision which cause them to spin in their tracks. These people have a drive which keeps them going through all the moments of suffering and heartbreak that life throws at them. And it allows them to persevere through the kinds of struggle that would be impossible, given an empty, hopeless outlook. One of the reasons why meaning in one's life is such an important thing to find is because it allows us to bear through pain we otherwise wouldn't. Think of something as simple as exercise. When we endure the strain on our joints, the burn in our muscles, and the ache on our sides, it is not because we enjoy these sensations. The reason why we push through them and continue is so that we can have healthier bodies and better looks. We would not go through the pain of exercise if it did not have rewards. In this way, having purpose is deeply connected to our ability to bear pain. Why does the parent work begrudgingly long hours to provide for their children? Because they love them. They wouldn't work the extra shift if they didn't have anyone to come home to. Similarly, think of soldiers who go through hell on earth to defend their nation. One would not risk death and injury if they didn't have a country to come back to. Without purpose, why would anyone bear pain at all? If there is no reason for being alive, why suffer another second? Our sense of purpose is intimately connected to our will to live. And so, even if your purpose is simple, even if it seems nonsensical to others, having some semblance of a direction in life can work wonders on your mind. I can tell you that in my particular life I view meaning as anything which makes me feel fulfilled. At night I ask myself, am I happy? Have the tasks I've completed made me feel accomplished? Am I satisfied with my present conditions? Do I feel motivated to continue on with tomorrow's tasks? If the answer to any of these questions is no, the next question should be, how can I make it a yes? And if the answer is yes, the next question should be, how can I continue to make it a yes? As long as you are making progress towards personally fulfilling goals, you are actively living a meaningful life. What makes you feel this way is completely arbitrary and will vary due to personal preference, but it is a noble goal to pursue nonetheless. Now, some people are disheartened by the fact that there isn't one predetermined and objective purpose for their life. They feel that if meaning is an arbitrary function of the brain, that it is somehow worthless, imaginary, or non-existent. This couldn't be further from the truth. The best way I can describe the reality of meaning is to compare it to the reality of love. Understand that love, like any emotional state, evolved in humans because it was an adaptive trait. It helped incentivize sexual attraction between mates, fraternal bonds within kinship groups, and protective instincts within parents. All of this, through an evolutionary lens, can be viewed as strictly pragmatic. It is a means by which our genes propagate in the most efficient and effective way. To a cynical viewer, this means that our relationships are hollow and our love inauthentic. However, upon further examination, it is easy to see why this is not the case. While it is true that the emotion of love evolved out of biological necessity, we have in many ways outgrown its initial function. There are couples in this world who are gay, infertile, or simply uninterested in children, who will never reproduce and yet marry nonetheless. Their relationships are not founded upon anything adaptive in an evolutionary sense. Instead, their bond is based on a sense of love which has transcended its original purpose. Even in couples who do reproduce, hardly will you find a husband and wife who say they're together exclusively for children. Lovers have other motivations behind their actions, including passion, care, and affection. When we look at other emotions, we can see that it is similarly so. Consider fun activities, particularly the rough-and-tumble play we see in sports. It is believed by many evolutionary psychologists that rough-and-tumble play is a way to simulate combat in animals. In animals where play is observed, those which naturally are predators enjoy doing the chasing, whereas those which are natural prey tend to enjoy being chased. There is an evolutionary, adaptive reasoning for all this. Yet this is not why we play sports. It's not why children wrestle in the mud, or why we enjoy watching action entertainment. The reason why we do these things is because it's fun. Even if the original reason was combat preparedness, we've moved past that now. And the list goes on. We could say that the reason people enjoy music is because they've evolved to recognize patterns and enjoy certain tones of voice. Yet even if these traits have adaptive advantages, we don't listen to music because it's adaptive. We do it because we enjoy music. So think about all these different examples. If we can love for its own sake, and we can play for its own sake, and we can listen to music for its own sake, why can't we live for its own sake? I think we can. I think that's what humans have been doing ever since we were able to conceive of complex thoughts. Life is about more than mere survival and the proliferation of genes. We give life meaning with each of our perceptions. We imbue it with quality by the very act of being alive. In the same way the mind perceives light waves and assigns them color, the mind perceives an indifferent cosmos and assigns it meaning. To say that life has no meaning is the same as saying a rainbow has no color. Absent your mind, this might very well be true. But you are here, and your perceptions are based upon something very real and legitimate. It is also worth pointing out that just because your brain constructs something doesn't mean it's a conscious choice. Your mind is what causes the leaves to appear green and the sky to appear blue, yet you didn't choose for the sky to be blue. You have no control over this process. It's entirely unconscious. And couldn't you say the same thing about meaning? What makes you feel fulfilled is not entirely under your control. There may be times where instead of choosing your meaning, you have to go out and discover it. Most people are aware that meaning is at least partially derived internally. Yet they are reluctant to adopt a totally individualistic outlook because they believe life is about more than pure self-actualization. People want to believe they are destined for something, that their lives serve a purpose greater than themselves. This transcendent cause is what they would like to dedicate their lives to, and it's not unreasonable for them to feel this way. To some, pursuing exclusively self-serving goals feels shallow. Our wants and needs are insignificant when compared to that of the species as a whole, and it would be nice if we could do something to contribute more. When one tries to follow God's plan, this is precisely what they're attempting. Yet, there is another way to think about life's significance which does not require a supernatural being of any kind. It is to be found in righteous duty. In Chapter 3 you will recall that I used the example of a blood cell to describe how an organism can be both an individual creature and part of a greater collective. I argued that human beings may benefit from seeing themselves this way because it is literally true. We are both autonomous individuals with our own rights, wishes and goals, as well as constituent parts of something bigger. This something bigger may be your community, your country, your species, the ecosystem, or even the universe as a whole. Whatever it is, if you are looking for a purpose beyond yourself, there is plenty of meaning to be found in service to others. If you feel a sense of duty towards the environment, you can earn a STEM degree and use your knowledge to create beneficial technologies for sustainability. Or you can become an activist lawyer, organizing social movements to protect our most vulnerable ecosystems. You could become a veterinarian, or a sustainable agriculturalist, or help animals in shelters find homes where they'll be safe. There are a variety of ways one can do to serve Mother Earth. And if your sense of duty is geared towards humanity, there are a variety of ways you can contribute to that too. The soldier who fights fascists and terrorist groups is defending civilization, as is the medical researcher developing life-saving drugs and vaccines, as is the statesman who passes legislation protecting our liberties and the environment, as is the journalists and teachers who keep the populace informed, as are the farmers who grow our food, as are the plumbers and electricians that make the water flow and the lights turn on, as are the truckers, merchants and waste disposal workers that allow organized civilization to be possible. Everyone who contributes to civilization, while not actively taking part in its destruction, are living lives of meaning to a certain degree. No matter how small or seemingly insignificant their profession, they are doing something to further the human story and sustain the quality of our lives in the process. This is what I want for people. Not merely to experience and enjoy life, but to produce and achieve as well. To not only observe the world, but be an active participant in it. The only thing to be careful about when pursuing your life's purpose is to make sure it's genuinely yours, and not something you feel compelled to accept by another. Don't let a holy book or your peers or your parents, or the popular culture at large influence what you think your life should be about. Do what makes you feel authentically yourself, as long as it does not inflict unnecessary suffering on other innocent beings. Besides that, your life is your own. Use it as you think best. Because at the end of the day, your life is fleeting, as are the lives of those around you. And worrying about the opinions of others as your life's clock is ticking is a waste of time. We can all passionately pursue our dreams, while striving towards a common humanistic goal in the process. That which makes us feel fulfilled and that which improves the world can be one and the same thing. All it takes is an inner conviction and a willingness to follow it. Chapter 8: The Disutility of Dogma. One of the arguments often made in the defense of religion is that it bestows upon a society certain values that it would otherwise not have. In this way, it is argued that we should care less about the factuality of religion, and instead focus on the social utility these beliefs bring with them. For much of human history, religion was seen as the guiding principle of life. It was believed that morality came from God, and that by following His word and His scripture one was considered righteous. Because of this, churches, mosques and temples acted much like a glue in the social fabric of society. Their organized bodies of religious leaders dictated moral codes out to the local populace, and brought them together under a shared value system. This shared value system, they argue, is what is responsible for the success of modern civilization. If it were not for the great Judeo-Christian virtues of honesty, charity and self-sacrifice, we would not have a stable civilization at all. Much of the achievements of modernity are attributed to the values bestowed by faith. Yet when we contrast this both with history and the broader world, does this argument really stand up? In the past century, we have seen an explosive rise in the development of human rights. Women's suffrage, civil rights, labor rights, gay rights, and the rise of democracy are at an all-time high in comparison with the centuries prior to ours. At the same time, we are seeing a growing number of people identifying with a category known as the nones, people who do not identify with an organized faith at all. One would think that if a rejection of religious institutions lead to a nihilistic collapse of society, it would have happened. But what we found is the opposite. As society gets more secular, it generally improves. The two trends are interlinked in a way. And this, I believe, is the result of giving people intellectual freedom. There was a time in history when church attendance was at an all-time high, where not only did religious values dominate the culture, they dictated the very laws of the land. Christian theocracy was the status quo in Western Europe for over 1,000 years, and it ushered in an era we know as the Dark Ages. In this time, women were second-class citizens, society was rife with serfdom and involuntary servitude, the divine right of kings held nations in oppressive monarchy, and science itself was being suppressed and openly fought against. It is no coincidence that the darkest part of Western history was also the most religious. For when you look at the modern-day nations who most closely resemble medieval Europe, you will find that they too are religious theocracies, with cultures predicated on the values of Abrahamic religion. Take the Middle East. Many of the nations from Jordan to Saudi Arabia, still in the 21st century, have a line of kings that are divinely ordained. Not only this, but women are owned with no bodily autonomy of their own. Atheists, polytheists, and homosexuals are systematically persecuted by an indifferent state. And there is still holy war waged between Sunni and Shia, not unlike the Catholics and Protestants of the Reformation. These theocrats, whether they be the Grand Ayatollah, the House of Saud, the mullahs of Afghanistan, or the Islamic State, all take part in wretched human rights abuses in the name of God. And they aren't simply using religion as a cover for their actions either. The religious conviction of these people is often quite genuine. It was observed in the most recent war in Iraq, for example, that ISIS was basing much of its operations out of a city called Dabiq, Syria. This city held little in the way of strategic advantage for the jihadist group, but it did have religious significance as the site of an Islamic prophecy. In the old Quranic scripture, it was said that Dabiq would be the place where the armies of the East would defeat the armies of the West. This was a battle that would signal end times and bring about the triumph of Islam. And it is no surprise then why thousands of jihadists and Islamic sympathizers would flock to the area in response. This is what blind adherence to ideology brings. When you consider the amount of devotion it takes to detonate bombs on oneself, killing friend and foe alike on the basis of their scripture, it shows an absolute certainty in the existence of the supernatural, and an unquestioning adherence to the morality of religious dictates. This is a phenomenon that we usually call fundamentalism, but it's important to note that fundamentalism is a strict and literal reading of the scripture, not a dishonest reading of the opposite. When the Quran says to kill the idolaters wherever you find them, and capture them and besiege them and sit and wait for them in every place of ambush, it is not surprising that the jihadists would choose to massacre non-believers. Similarly, in the Bible when it says, "If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death." It is not surprising that homosexuals have faced murder, violence and persecution systematically throughout Christian history. The values preached by Abrahamic religions are deeply antiquated and immoral, yet the only defense apologists seem to have is that the scripture also preaches good things. And this is of course true. There is plenty of love, charity and community service that has been conducted by members of every faith over the years. But imagine if the advice presented in the scripture was coming not from a book, but instead a person. Imagine if a man based his actions purely on what the Bible tells him to do. He treats his neighbors with respect, works hard, prays in the morning, donates to the poor, and spends a considerable amount of time volunteering for the community. But every once in a while, he takes a break from his usual routine and goes and beats gay men to death with rocks. How would we respond to such a man? While I can't speak for everyone, I would assume most people would call the police and get him locked up for life. The fact that he has done all these other good things does not refute the fact that he has just committed a horrific crime. In the same way, we can see how the good advice in the Bible does not refute the bad. All the passages of love, kindness, and charity are not enough to create a moral foundation if they also include the advocation of murder and persecution. This is especially egregious because the Bible is a book that claims to be ordained by God. With traditional literature and philosophy, one can agree with certain points of an author and discard the others. But religion demands that we try to model our lives as closely to the scripture as possible. In fact, it claims that when we stray from God's word, we are actually living sinfully. Because of this, true believers cannot have a critical view of the work. Their personal perspective is not allowed to clash with that of the great Creator. What good is a passage like "Thou shalt not murder" if "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live" is held in equal esteem? What good is "Thou shalt not steal" if the conquest of land and people is justified only a few chapters later? The Bible is at best a contradiction, and at worst an abhorrent book that hides its toxic ideology behind a set of common-sense platitudes masked as virtue. The same can be said of the Quran, the Hadith, and the Jewish Torah, as well as the religious mythologies of the Far East. We all want to live in a world that is peaceful and happy. But not if that world is built by snuffing out dissent through violent force and thought control. Every society that has put religious values above secular ones has had negative results. In medieval Europe, it was the Crusades, Inquisition, and divinely ordained monarchy. And in the Middle East, it's honor killings, forced marriages, and jihad. The Mongols of 13th century Asia believed they were blessed by a great Tengrist pantheon, as they massacred 10% of the Earth's population. And we see Buddhist monks in modern-day Myanmar supporting military death squads as they ethnically cleanse religious minorities. These various societies, separated across vast distances and time periods, are almost completely different socially and culturally. Yet they all share one small thing in common that motivates their completely wretched actions: religion. Religious values are so convoluted that they blur the lines on our moral compass. Their contradiction is what causes moral confusion, and leads perfectly good people to fall into evil action. I have no doubt that many of the soldiers of the old Islamic caliphates donated to charity in between their conquests of foreign lands. Just as I have no doubt that many Zen monks took part in peaceful meditation hours before operating bomber planes in World War II. The good has never justified the bad throughout religious history. And as we are moving towards an era where human behavior is radically affecting the planet, we have to decide whether these backwards values are worth preserving. Some fear that if we abandon religious values and the institutions of faith altogether, we will be left in a state of aimlessness that tears society apart. But what is important to remember is that we've been straying away from religious values ever since the Enlightenment. When church attendance was no longer compelled, and when the printing press allowed people to read scripture for themselves, radically new ideas about facts and values entered the discourse. When people no longer depended on a priestly class to tell them what was true, they began to take matters into their own hands. The Protestant Reformation was so crucial because it ended the Catholic monopoly on Christian faith in Western Europe. People could have ideas rival to the Pope, and utter them in safe places without violent retribution. This led to the development of new competing churches, and a fresh political landscape that wrestled influence away from the once supreme Vatican. Totalitarian ideologies, however, cannot help but try and force themselves on others, and as a result Europe devolved into seemingly endless warfare for the next few hundred years. The schism between Catholic and Protestant showed people just how murderous they could become over slight differences in interpretation over a holy book. It exemplified how ruthless they could become in their fervor to convert. There were, however, concerned Christians who realized that there was not going to be some final sectarian victory in their lifetime. They understood that if they wanted the bloodshed to stop, they had to establish a political order that would allow religious tolerance and a certain amount of free thought. These progressive Christians were among the first secularists. Though they were not always successful in their respective countries, these men and women strived for the freedom of expression in their societies. Among those inspired by the Enlightenment-era secularists were revolutionaries such as the Founding Fathers of the United States. This is why it is always laughable when ignorant individuals make the claim that America was founded on Christianity. The truth couldn't be more different. America was founded mainly by Christians, this is true, though there were many deists in the mix including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, but it was founded entirely on secular values. The very first line of the Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not have any other gods before me." Yet the only time religion is mentioned in the Constitution is to say, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the Bible instructs one to have no other gods but the Lord, and the U.S. Constitution specifically allows for people to worship all sorts of other gods besides the Lord. Additionally, nowhere in the Bible does it call for the right to vote. Not for women, not for minorities, not even for white men. It instead calls on the reader to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and pay taxes to the largest empire of the time. Throughout both the Old and New Testaments, it is advised very clearly for people to become complacent in their bondage. This is exemplified by the fact that the Bible never condemns slavery. In fact, the New Testament even endorses it in passages like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." Ephesians chapter 6 verse 5. The Apostle Peter goes on to cement this, saying, "Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh." Peter chapter 2 verse 18. Now one would hope that at least the Son of God would have some word of liberation for the millions of men and women in bondage at the time of the Gospels, but such a speech was never made. Jesus never called for the abolition of slavery, nor did he call for the overturning of the Mosaic laws that endorsed them in the first place. And why would he? He has never been a champion for freedom, for he ironically supports the greatest dictatorship of the human imagination, God. A being which the late Christopher Hitchens rightly called a celestial dictator. One who keeps us under constant surveillance, seeks to control our private lives, and will mercilessly condemn us to an eternity of torture if we do not submit to his will and beg forgiveness. The Bible is not at all a champion of individual human freedom, which is why it is an insult to suggest that the American Constitution was founded on it. The Constitution, just like many other progressive documents over the ages, was a work of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, in turn, was not a product of Christianity, but of the secular revolution that allowed free thought. When people were given the intellectual liberty to think for themselves, it opened the doorway for new innovations. This allowed scientists to come out of the shadows, philosophers to publish radical new theories, and classical conceptions of liberty and egalitarianism to re-emerge from the dustbins of history. One must remember that before Christianity became the status quo, democracy and early forms of republicanism existed in the Western world. It was not until after the Enlightenment's rejection of theocratic laws that these systems could be implemented in the West once more. Liberalism, capitalism, and the scientific revolution led to a drastic increase in human standards of living and an ethical progression that we can appreciate all the way to this day. Still, however, there are those who refuse to acknowledge the role secularism played in advancing civilization. They still cling to the notion that it is Judeo-Christian values that are responsible for our prosperity, and this ignores all the historical attempts by organized faith to suppress it. The reason why such cognitive dissonance is even possible is because most Christians live in the West. They see that the material conditions of their home countries are superior to that of, say, rural Afghanistan, and so they come away with the conclusion that it must have something to do with Christianity. But the plight of the Islamic world has little to do with a lack of Christianity. The plight of the Islamic world has to do with theocracy, dictatorship, and the legacy of imperialism. During the early Abbasid Caliphate of the 9th century, an era of social and religious tolerance occurred which allowed a considerable degree of innovation and free thought. At the same time, mathematical concepts such as algebra were being developed by Persian scholars, and newly invented devices such as the astrolabe were revolutionizing navigation. Just as in 18th century Europe, the creation of an open tolerant society led the way for technological and social progress to happen. Had it not been for a Mongol invasion, multiple crusades, and internal corruption, the Middle East might still be the center of scientific development to this day. The key to salvation for those still stuck under theocratic rule is not a different religion, it is less religion. As societies become more secular, they often open themselves up to positive changes, and we can now see why. When apologists for the Christian faith claim that Judeo-Christian values are the foundations of a stable society, remind them of world history. It was not their values which improved standards of living, it was our secular movement away from them. The way they retort this is to try and claim a monopoly on moral virtue. They make the false association that because the vast majority of us don't regularly lie, murder, and steal, and because the 10 Commandments tell us not to lie, murder, and steal, that we must be doing this because of the 10 Commandments. In this way, Christians imply causation where none exists. They try to assert a religious explanation where none has been demonstrated. What one has to understand is that just because something is accomplished by a member of a group or ideology does not mean that it was done because of that group or ideology. When the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik spacecraft into orbit in 1957, this was the first artificial satellite ever crafted by the human race. One might even point out that it was built by a group of communists. Yet can we say communism is what causes rockets to be built? Of course not. American capitalists built even better rockets only years later. The same positive outcome can be achieved from widely different systems, and morality works in the same way. Almost every society in history has made rules against unwarranted murder and theft. The idea that thou shalt not kill is a unique law, or that Christians have some special claim to non-violence, is absolutely absurd when one considers everything we know about human sociology. Every culture has expressed an inclination towards moral virtue, and this is because morality is based on something innate inside of us. We're all capable of good and evil. And we're all capable of appealing to reason. That's why I take issue with the notion that Enlightenment values are Christian or even Western in their nature. They can be adopted anywhere, by any race or nationality. We need not appeal to Western chauvinism when Japan, South Korea, India, Israel, Iraqi Kurdistan, Brazil, and various nations throughout the Pacific continue on in the Enlightenment tradition. These are places in the world that are as far east and south as one can think, and yet they are secular, democratic, and concerned with individual rights because ultimately Enlightenment values are human values. Once you convince individuals to adopt secularism over theocracy, and to treat their scripture more like literature than a scientific text, you get the beginnings of a moderation which helps pacify religious movements of their worst tendencies. Moderation is helpful in that it curbs fundamentalism and the impulse to forcibly convert, but it is unhelpful in the ways it helps religion adapt to criticism. The best example of this is through the dishonest use of interpretation, where religious leaders modify the meaning of a text not because of mistranslation or new historical findings, but because it does not fit our current paradigm of the world. Nowadays, it's common for progressive Christians to speak out against homophobia in the popular culture, seeking to distinguish themselves from their more conservative members. However, the Bible they profess to believe in specifically calls for people of different sexual orientations to be executed. The amount of mental gymnastics that one has to employ in order for the book of Leviticus to seem tolerant is astronomical. And while we can appreciate the efforts of progressive Christian activists to increase tolerance in their communities, it would be better if they abandoned their scripture altogether. The same can be said for young earth creationism. It is undoubtedly clear that the world was not created in 7 days. Yet, instead of admitting that the book of Genesis is wrong, apologists will dishonestly argue that a day actually means a period of millions of years. Nowhere in the Bible does it suggest this is the case. The only reason it is being argued is because those peddling scripture can't admit the mistake. The world is far better with religious moderation than without it, yet we should remember that as long as the scripture continues to be held sacred, the potential for fundamentalism always exists. Just because a berry smells pleasant doesn't mean its juices aren't poisonous, and similarly, just because a religion appears benevolent doesn't mean its underlying beliefs aren't toxic. With the rise of smart technology and an increased access to information, people are beginning to realize their personal values don't align with those contained in ancient books. We don't need religious institutions telling us how to live our lives or what to value. We can use our own critical faculties to reason about the world and determine which values are genuinely worth holding. This fact terrifies theocrats because the freedom to choose for oneself implies the freedom to make mistakes. And among those who consider themselves secular and godless, there have been some who chose values which were less than humane. Notice here that I use words like enlightenment, secular, and progressive, rather than the word atheist, because atheism, as I have explained before, is not an ideology. It is a lack of ideology. Just because one is without a belief in God, does not mean they subscribe to the view of a free and open society. Generally atheists do, but just as in the case of the religious, there are those who would prefer to force their worldview on others. During the 19th century, there were groups of people who subscribed to the philosophy known as dialectical materialism. This was the idea that the material conditions of society drove the social forces of history. This, when combined with a violent conception of class conflict, gave way to the radical ideology known as Marxism. Marxism was a doctrine that was exclusively atheist, but also had a number of legal and moral tenets that one had to adopt in order to be a member. When religious individuals argue against an entirely atheistic society, they often ask, what about the atheists who killed 100 million people during the 20th century? And this is a fair question to ask. It would make little sense to abandon religion if worship of the state was the only alternative. The atrocities carried out by Marxist-Leninist regimes from Russia to Cuba to China easily compare to any of the atrocities committed by the Christian Crusaders or Islamic jihadists. The communist dictatorships led by Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong were so violent that their death tolls outnumber even Hitler's by millions. This goes to show that atheists are just as capable of evil as religious people, and do not need a command from heaven in order to take part in grotesque bloodshed. If ever there was a notion that atheists were above evil, the 20th century would prove that very much to the contrary. However, what history cannot demonstrate is that these atrocities were committed because of atheism. This might seem like a double standard, in that I am attributing carnage to religion but not to atheism, but there's really one clear difference between the two. Atheism is not an ideology. It is the application of skepticism to the supernatural. Skepticism alone cannot bring one to violence. Only belief in an ideology can. Besides the rejection of God, you really have no idea what an atheist believes until you meet them. There have been atheist communists, atheist libertarians, atheist Democrats, and atheist Republicans. There have been atheist psychopaths, atheist geniuses, atheist mass murderers, and dedicated atheist humanitarians. The range of worldviews and professions atheists have adopted is innumerable. And so if a non-believer commits a horrible crime, that crime should be attributed to whatever belief motivated them. In the case of Soviet Russia, the ideology motivating mass murder was Marxist-Leninism. It was not a move toward secularism, or an abandonment of the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, one can really argue that the Soviet Union wasn't secular. Because although secularism is often defined as the separation of church and state, its underlying principle, freedom of belief, was not present in the country. There was no liberty of self-expression outlined in a formally acknowledged constitution. One had to adopt communism or else suffer the consequences. And while the consequences of dissent could never compare to an eternity in hell, 30 years in a forced labor camp was by no means appealing. In this way, communism was like a theocracy for a materialist ideology. It had all the traits and attributes of a religion, except for the supernatural component. It even had its own conception of original sin. A person is born into a society not of their own choosing, and must take part in consumption in order to live. Commodities must be purchased in the form of food, clothing, housing, and transportation. And because these commodities are produced with exploited labor, the very act of living can be considered an immoral act. Therefore, one must repent in this regard, and dedicate themselves to the ideology in order to fix it. But by fixing it, one begins striving towards building the socialist paradise. They are seeking a heaven right here on this earth, while simultaneously creating a hell in the process. In addition to original sin, the Marxists were also highly sectarian. Their founders were revered like saints, with Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, each having their own personality cult. People killed each other, and compelled their adversaries into forced labor camps over small differences of opinion in the Marxist doctrine. And when it came to Kim Il-sung and his family in North Korea, they are still worshipped by the citizenry to this very day. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, the populace took to the streets and wept. They took part in this hysteric action, for if they did not, there was a real chance they would be taken away by the secret police. Commonly in North Korean schools, it is taught that their leader can perform miracles, such as curing disease and controlling the weather. And when Kim Jong-un took power, it was said that he learned to drive at the age of 3. Marxist dictators claim to be able to pull off all sorts of wondrous feats, but in reality it seems they only cover up horrendous disasters. This is another trait communism shares with religion: the inability to observe facts that contradict the dogma. In early communist China, it was believed that collectivization would lead to more efficient farm yields. Yet when the data came in suggesting underperformance and even famine, the ruling elites were unwilling to stray from their basic Marxist axiom. Because of this inability to change course, millions died of hunger. And even at the worst of these setbacks, the party bureaucrats were unwilling to take responsibility. They saw the hands of corrupt capitalist forces in everything, just as the Christians saw the devil behind their shortcomings. This paranoia caused them to lash out at innocent targets, creating a moral panic on a scale never before seen in a secular society. Mao Zedong personally sent a mob of militant followers known as the Red Guard to kill thousands of his own party, without trial or evidence, for secretly holding capitalist sympathies. They tortured people for days and nights, until they got the false confessions they were looking for. This was every bit as insane as a witch burning, yet it was done in the name of a political ideology. When Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher, traveled to Russia in order to meet Vladimir Lenin, this is what he described from his book, The Practice and Theory of Bolshevism. I think if I had met him without knowing who he was, I should not have guessed that he was a great man. He struck me as too opinionated and narrowly orthodox. His strength comes, I imagine, from his honesty, courage, and unwavering religious faith in the Marxian gospel, which takes place of the Christian martyr's hopes of paradise, except that it is less egotistical. He has as little love of liberty as the Christians who suffered under Diocletian, and retaliated when they acquired power. Perhaps love of liberty is incompatible with wholehearted belief in a panacea for all human ills. If so, I cannot but rejoice in the skeptical temper of the Western world. I went to Russia a communist, but contact with those who have no doubts has intensified 1,000-fold my own doubt, not as to communism in itself, but as to the wisdom of holding a creed so firmly that for its sake men are willing to inflict widespread misery. It is remarkable the extent to which Bertrand Russell compares the Marxists to Christians. He saw the parallels in their ideology coming before the massacres of Stalin and Mao had even occurred. Granted, Russell was still sympathetic to communism at the time, but he could critically analyze the doctrine because Marx, at least in his eyes, was not considered an omniscient being. This is why anyone who claims that the atrocities of communism can be attributed to atheism and secularism are dead wrong. Russia never had a secular enlightenment where free inquiry reigned supreme. It went straight from the Russian Tsar, a monarch who was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, to Vladimir Lenin, a dictator who held dogmatically to the ideology of Marxist-Leninism. The same can be said of China, who for thousands of years had been conditioned to follow a single holy emperor under the mandate of heaven, only to turn to a one-party state that claimed a similar mandate from history. Additionally, communism is not the only secular ideology to produce mass harm. Nationalism, the cultish devotion to one's country, has led to countless wars, inquisitions, and ethnic cleansings. Liberal identity politics, the so-called woke movement, has many of the same characteristics as Marxism and fundamentalist Christianity. Conspiracy theorists claim the existence of shadowy, almost supernatural forces which control world events. And market fundamentalism had led to the wide-scale destruction of the environment. All of these ideologies can be adopted by atheists. None are compatible with a skeptical open mind. This goes to show that it is not good enough for a society to simply reject religion and its values. It must reject all doctrines which demand dogmatic compliance. It is only then, with a truly free and open society, that humanity can prosper. The world has not collapsed into chaos as worldwide religiosity has declined, because most unbelievers have not turned to nihilism in its wake. The values of liberty, equality, reason and compassion have won the populace over in a remarkable way. Some even like to use the word humanism to describe these values because it is a simple, all-encompassing term which describes the effort to address value concerns directly. Humanism, generally speaking, is a way in which we use reason to improve each other's lives in the here and now. Actions are taken not to please some higher being or to contribute to a long karmic chain. Instead, good is done for its own sake towards a greater fairness and understanding amongst caring people. There will of course be disagreement in the solutions to our problems, as all critical thinkers know. But this reorientation of our goals towards something terrestrial and beautiful is a thing worth striving for. As John Lennon once said, imagine all the people living for today. Note: humanism is perhaps the best word we have to describe the value system which prioritizes our wants and needs in the here and now. This is why I use it in the chapter above. However, there is just one problem with using the term. Our moral concerns are not exclusive to humanity. They apply to animals, ecosystems, and perhaps even machines one day if they ever become conscious. For this reason, humanism is already an outdated term. Animalism, however, sounds more like a conservation movement, and sentientism just doesn't roll well off the tongue. Perhaps spirituality could be a useful label if by spirit one means the contents of our consciousness and not an eternal soul. However, because of the word's mystic connotation, I'm not sure spirituality is a useful term quite yet. We need something beyond spirituality, as the title of this book suggests. If you can think of a word that better describes a concern for the well-being of all conscious creatures in the here and now, please let me know. We need not be restrained by past terminology in order to describe this comprehensive worldview. Chapter 9: The Alternative to Scripture. We live in a world that is increasingly growing secular. The old conceptions of sin, virtue, and a God-based morality are beginning to fade away. In the wake of this exciting new era, the old centers of moral preaching are beginning to lose their influence. And while it is a good thing that these dogmatic institutions no longer have a complete chokehold over our culture, it seems necessary that we still have a societal outlet for promoting our values. If it is not to be the churches, mosques, and temples that bestow wisdom onto our youth, what should this outlet be? We do not want to brainwash our children in the public schools like the religious do theirs, nor do we want an authoritarian state that plays an active role in policing the culture. With this in mind, it will fall to a third institution to instill values in the general public. Traditionally, one of the ways in which values have been promoted is through Scripture. Scripture has been the means by which complex ideas are communicated to the faithful in a simple way. Many values in the Bible, for example, are presented in the form of Jesus' parables. Many lessons of the old Greek folklore come from oral traditions and myths. The benefit of having a mythology in one's culture is that you can instill values onto young and old alike, without having to lecture one on the underlying philosophy. Storytelling in this way then becomes a powerful tool, for it allows a shared form of communication that almost everyone can grasp. The biggest problem that comes from Scripture, however, is its insistence on making truth claims. Any positive message that one hopes to draw from mythology is immediately undermined if it causes people to deny science and history. Not only this, but as I have demonstrated in the previous chapter, religious values are not particularly moral either. Since Scripture is a thing that is dogmatic, inaccurate, and immoral by nature, we must reject it. But in contrast to Scripture, there is a tool that can be used for essentially the same thing. It is our contemporary media. The wonders of art, film, and literature. Media consumption is an activity that is in no way compelled, and that, at least in principle, is selected by merit. When people enjoy a piece of art, it is usually because it has appealed to their preferences. When they tear up at a song or laugh at a movie, it's because it has resonated with something deep within them. This is not a behavior that can simply be conditioned. It must be earned. The intrinsic wonder of art hints at a value that is at least partially innate. And unlike religious dogmatism, it does not invoke the subtle threat of torment for rejecting its message. This means of inspiration rather than compulsion is a much better method for changing minds. While it is not a perfect system, and allows ample room for mistakes, it creates a medium through which controversial issues can be tackled in the abstract. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the sole substitute for an experience which we have not ourselves lived through is art and literature. It is through storytelling that people can learn lessons without having to experience the hardships they are based on. This wisdom can then be passed on from one generation to the next, so that youth don't have to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors. In America, children are often told the infamous tale of the boy who cried wolf. This is a short tale about a habitual liar whose dishonesty comes back to hurt him when no one believes he is being attacked by a wolf. While the story's direct effect is to scare children into honesty, it also portrays the clear logic of why one should be honest to begin with. In this way, the archetype of the dishonest child is one we're taught to avoid, and children are raised to develop a value for honesty as a consequence. Not all archetypal figures have inspired good behavior, however. Sometimes the popular culture perpetuates values that make us more brutish, divisive, and tribal. For instance, one can argue about the historicity of Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. But what appears to be fairly uncontroversial is that Alexander the Great kept a copy of this tale by his bedside for much of his life. The character of Achilles deeply inspired his desire for glory and informed his image of what a man should be. And when you put this in context with a leader who forged an empire and reshaped the ancient world, this is pretty significant. What we teach people to value carries on well into adulthood. Which is why what we promote artistically and intellectually matters so much. Writing, film, and other forms of entertainment have been instrumental in changing the way people think and feel for hundreds of years. Books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in the 20th century revolutionized the way we conduct health standards in the modern food industry. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe portrayed the cruelty of slavery and humanized its victims in the lead-up to the Civil War. Even more recently, George Orwell's fiction novels 1984 and Animal Farm have played a major role in the fall of communism and the modern-day resistance against authoritarianism. But it's not just that. Filmmakers in Hollywood have intentionally drafted Black, Asian, Hispanic, and homosexual characters throughout their stories as a means of humanizing them. By causing people to empathize with characters of a different identity, they have been able to help fight cultural prejudices against various minorities. Star Trek televised the first interracial kiss in 1968. This was considered an outrage at the time, Yet now interracial relationships are a simple norm of life 50 years later. Storytelling has been proficient at taking ideas that seemed controversial at the time and making them commonplace. One of the problems with modern entertainment is that it's often too repetitive and unoriginal. We have plenty of action-packed films which shock the senses and dazzle the eyes, but too often their plots are forgotten soon after watching. These are not the type of stories people show to their children 20 years later. They're not the type of stories that stimulate thought-provoking conversation well into the night. What makes a story special is when it overcomes the mediocrity which plagues modern media. When it does more than simply entertain and becomes a true cultural phenomenon. Take the Star Wars films by George Lucas, for example, not the Disney abominations. Star Wars, in every sense of the word, is a modern-day myth. It is a tale about redemption, both on the individual level and the societal level. It shows a man's rise to prominence, fall to darkness, and struggle to rise back again. It shows a democratic society degenerate and fall into dictatorship, and then struggle to restore its democracy once more. Star Wars goes well out of its way to emphasize the values of love, patience, and discipline. It warns against tyranny and subservience to evil, and quotes to the audience memorable passages such as "Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering." Without these values, the tales would be no different than any other science fiction movie. Yet perhaps the most important value marketed by Star Wars was the ideal of what it means to be the perfect Jedi. Throughout the original trilogy, the character Luke Skywalker is being groomed to kill his father and win the final conflict against evil in the universe. He is told that Darth Vader is the epitome of evil and must be destroyed in order to win. What he soon learns, however, is that Vader is not the antagonist of the series but the victim. We are shown through a series of prequels that the man was not inherently evil, but driven to evil by the tragedies in his life. He was twisted and seduced by darkness, but still had a bit of humanity left in him. This is important in a story because it maps onto a real truth about society. There are some people in this world who are sadists and psychopaths, like the character of the Emperor, who enjoy cruelty and inflicting pain for its own sake. But most people we consider evil are actually more like Vader. They do not begin evil, instead they are brought into it by a lifetime of trauma. How often has child abuse, drug addiction, war, exposure to violence, and the loss of loved ones twisted men's minds? How often has fear and desperation and intense ideological indoctrination taken good people and turned them bad? Most of the villains in this world were not born evil, but molded into it by the conditions of their society. Within them is still a sliver left of humanity, and in that fact lays the key to their redemption. Star Wars was brilliant because it didn't portray the same cliché we see in other stories of ultimate good eliminating ultimate evil. It showed that the struggle for good is within all of us, and that by seizing on the human element, evil can be overcome from within. This internal struggle applies not only to the individual, but to society as a whole. Notice that when the heroes won at the end of Return of the Jedi, they didn't genocide the members of the Empire. They didn't conquer or exterminate the society they fought against. Instead, they inspired revolution from within and redeemed the entire galaxy. These kinds of redemptions are important to portray because they have been crucial throughout our history. We've seen empires become republics, monarchies become democracies, communist countries revert back to liberalism. In the same way, we've seen violent criminals become selfless humanitarians, drug addicts become health advocates, and fundamentalists become voices of reason. These real-life examples go to show that people even in mass numbers can change. They may never become moral perfectionists, but it proves that rehabilitation can work at every level of society. This value of humanizing the enemy, of hearing one's opponent out, and trying to rehabilitate even the lowest among us is a thing worth emulating. It is a value every person should hold, and it just so happens to be marketed by one of the biggest film franchises in history. This is where the true potential of secular mythology lies. When one thinks about the worst societies in human history, they usually depended on these values being absent. Consider the Holocaust, the Inquisition, or any totalitarian society where purges have taken place. Before the bloodshed could occur, it was usually preceded by an intense period of division and dehumanization first. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were portrayed as subhuman for a number of years before they were systematically killed. In the times of slavery and Old World eugenics, African Americans were portrayed as animalistic and in need of taming. Even in the modern day, Arabs are often portrayed as invasive or even parasitic by individuals who have never shared their company. By making classes of people the other, societies can fall into a mindset whereby genocides take place. By dividing the populace against itself, there is no common solidarity to keep tyrants in check. This method of division is how societies fall and atrocities occur. But if one reinforces humanistic values and instills in their culture a means by which the other is just the us, violence on such a scale becomes decreasingly possible. This is why I think films like Star Wars are so crucial. On the surface level, they are just entertaining movies. But on a deeper level, they are projecting many of the values that are key not just to a stable personal life, but to a stable democracy itself. If we could teach children to analyze literature and identify the deeper levels of meaning within film, we could teach tremendous lessons to them without the need of endless lectures or heavily jargoned reading. Imagine if in school, for example, we discussed the Luke Skywalker method as a metaphorical example of how to treat people. Imagine that we ask them to be patient, to give people chances, to hear out their peers, to be brave, to resist the authoritarian and to value democracy. What kind of children would we raise if they could intelligently draw inspiration from these timeless stories? Modern mythologies act as metaphorical templates for healthy societies. Yet the difference between a mythology like Star Wars and a mythology of the religious variety is that basically no one in the world believes Star Wars literally happened. If they did, it would cease to be a heartwarming tale and suddenly become a real danger to society. Because the moment people believe things that aren't true is the moment people's reasoning becomes corrupted. Imagine if people blocked cancer research because they were afraid it would damage the fictional idea of midi-chlorians. Imagine if millions of people rejected evolution because they actually believed there were human beings living a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. These are the sorts of unintended consequences that come when any sort of mythology takes itself literally. While Star Wars no doubt draws on inspiration from Greco-Roman myths, Eastern philosophy and Christian symbolism, it is an entirely secular enterprise. This is because it is clearly marketed as fiction and makes no claim about its own validity. If we want to tell stories that have a realist background and a literal message, we should do it by educating people in history. We should celebrate the egalitarian movements of the 1960s, led by Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists. We should cherish the struggle for democracy led by Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and other revolutionaries in the 13 colonies. We should applaud the labor movement and activists like Eugene Debs who strove to make the world a better place by improving workers' conditions. Teaching these stories will show not only that radical improvements in society have occurred, but that they can continue to occur in the future. We can teach our youth that institutions, no matter how corrupt and well established, can be abolished in the span of a single generation. It is in this way that we instill hope in a beleaguered youth, and give them evidence that they are justified in believing in a better tomorrow. We can show people the bright side of the human condition, and why it is a goal worth fighting for. There are many ways of inspiring positive values without resorting to lies. There are also many ways of celebrating the natural, physical and real, without sugarcoating the basic facts of existence. One of the things I admired about the late Professor Carl Sagan was that he wrote and spoke about science in a poetic fashion. When he explained the nuclear reactions in stars or the interstellar course of asteroids, it was as if he was giving a religious sermon. When he talked about the genetic code or the vast history of life on Earth, it was as if he was writing a love letter to nature. What if more of the individuals who taught science could invoke awe and inspiration in this way? Would we still have a general public that remains willfully ignorant of the basic mechanics of our universe? Would we still have a population that stubbornly clings to its superstitions without cause or reason? Perfection is the enemy of the good, and so I do not expect a world without aggression, superstition, ignorance and violence in the future. There will always be those who are beyond redemption, and those whom education and rehabilitation did not come in time. For those, we have a coercive criminal justice system that brings them to heel. The threat of death or imprisonment is a large enough incentive to dissuade most kinds of reprehensible crime. But for cultural questions, ones that the state has no business policing, it is essential that we have an artistic medium for discussing our values as a culture. So think about it. What if young men looked up to Mel Gibson's character of William Wallace as a figure of masculinity and noble strength? What if they used the Luke Skywalker method to give an open ear of compassion to even their most wretched peers? What if we used the novels of George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, and Kurt Vonnegut to give people a taste of authoritarianism without actually having to live under it? What if we used the writings of Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Stephen Hawking as a way to promote care and wonder about our universe? And what if we used history as a means of showing real moral progressions and society's potential to improve going forward? Literature, film, and art are some of our best tools for projecting humanistic values in this world. They are not as authoritative as some holy commandment threatening to punish one for their dissent, but they are a means of inspiring people towards good humanitarian goals. If we can manage within our culture to establish a secular tradition of storytelling and myth-making, we may have all the tools necessary to succeed where Scripture has failed. This is what we should work towards with great passion and cooperation. This is what we should strive for with all the creative energy in our hearts. Chapter 10: God and the Great Beyond. In the 5th century BC, there lived a man named Democritus who critically examined the world around him. On the shores of ancient Greece he marveled over grains of sand, and noticed their seeming relation to the rocks and boulders around him. In his mind, the big rocks seemed to share a similar character to the little rocks. It was as if they were made of the same underlying fabric, one that was simply scaled to different sizes. It was this line of thinking that caused him to begin pondering about the other elements around him. What was the difference between the oceans before him and the moisture on his fingers? What was the difference between a gust of wind and a single breath? Democritus began to formulate the idea that all material was made up of smaller composing parts. These parts were in turn made up of even smaller parts. And this process would go until there reached a single material that was indivisible and indestructible by nature. He called this material an atom. It was an idea that stayed popular in philosophical circles for over 2,000 years. Democritus' idea then moved out of philosophy and into mainstream science in the early 19th century, when a chemist named John Dalton gave the idea some credence. Dalton proposed that the reason why elements react in ratios of whole numbers is because there is an interaction going on between their fundamental units. His improved conception of the atom could be explained mathematically, and it was later confirmed in 1897 when Professor J.J. Thomson observed such a particle using a cathode ray tube. For the first time, many scientists believed they had finally discovered the basis of all matter. They had found a particle that composed all material objects, and for the most part operated under a consistent mode of physics. This caused a great deal of excitement in the early scientific community. There was just one problem, however. The atom was in no way indivisible as they had once thought. As we now know, atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. These subatomic particles form the structures that make the bonds in molecules possible, but they are not the fundamental basis of matter either. As we observe deeper still, we find quarks encompassing the bodies of both protons and neutrons. These discoveries have challenged our understanding of matter itself, and thoroughly blown away any conception that we found its fundamental unit. There are now scientists who think that even our smallest subatomic particles are in turn made up of smaller parts. Some hypothesize that it is a series of strings and membranes that compose our existence. Others propose multidimensional field theories and perhaps even structures lurking below the Planck scale. This goes to show that the perceived boundaries of our reality are constantly being challenged. Even when discoveries fit with the models of various scientists and philosophers, it is always unwise to assume them to be final. Even our most rigorous conclusions can be subject to new information. And we should be skeptical of any position that urges us to limit our imagination in this way. There have been many other times throughout history where our conventional views of reality were radically blown away. Take geocentrism, for example. There was once a time when the bulk of humanity thought the Earth was the center of the universe. This was a theory so compelling that the Church burned men at the stake for resisting it. It was a dogma pushed upon all people at the time. But it also wasn't clear at first why the model was incorrect. One could accurately predict eclipses using the geocentric model, they could identify the motion of stars and planets using it, and coupled with the conception of a flat Earth, it made sense in terms of direct human observation. Geocentric astronomy was not simply a pseudoscience or irrational faith, like many of the other Dark Age dogmas. It was a legitimate science that unfortunately was incomplete. This all changed, however, when Nicholas Copernicus, following in the legacy of the Greek mathematician Aristarchus, proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system. This explained everything from the changing of the seasons to the retrograde motion of planets, and convinced the public with incredible accuracy that the Sun was the center of the solar system. In this way, the entire paradigm of cosmological thought shifted. The Earth was no longer the center of the universe. And as we quickly realized with further observations, neither was the Sun. Each star in the sky was a sun just like our own. And when these stars grouped together in a visible way, they formed a megalithic structure called a galaxy. People were awestruck by this cosmic view in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But at the time, for all they knew, our galaxy was still the only one. Then suddenly that paradigm shifted too, when in 1929 Edwin Hubble, for which the Hubble telescope is named, discovered that some of our most distant stars were actually other galaxies. Through a series of high-resolution pictures taken with the Hooker telescope, he demonstrated that the nearby Andromeda Nebula was actually a cosmic body of nearly identical size to the Milky Way. Once again, the seeming boundaries of our universe continued to be shattered. Now the Hubble telescope sits up in orbit and has photographed literally thousands of galaxies and even galactic superclusters. It is now thought that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe, each with hundreds of billions of stars. And many of these stars in turn are likely to have planets. The amount of potential worlds out there are beyond comprehension. And while the current model of the universe is monumental, it may prove to be incomplete as well. For all we know, there could be entire universes beyond our view still waiting to be discovered. Monumental chasms of existence filled with trillions of foreign galaxies. Some scientists have even expanded our horizons further and proposed interpretations of string theory that could potentially lead to parallel universes or other dimensions. And this is of course not even considering the potential for supernatural or extranatural planes of existence. The limits of the size and scope of our existence are completely unknowable at the moment. And that should humble us in a substantial way. To put the grandiose immensity of our cosmos in perspective, I want to explain how difficult it is to conceptualize the numbers we're talking about. Consider the number 1 billion. It is a number you can easily write down on a piece of paper, but what does it mean? The number 1 billion is written as a 1 with 9 zeros behind it. If one were to count to 1 billion in the same way they count on their fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., it would take them approximately 30 years without stopping. 30 years. Just to count to 1 billion. Now in the Milky Way galaxy alone, there are over 400 billion stars. It would take from the time of Jesus and Julius Caesar, just to count all the stars in the galaxy. And then consider that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. If one tried to count all the stars in the known universe, or even the planets revolving around them, it would take longer than the universe is known to exist. It would take so long that stars would form, burn for billions of years and die, all before you were finished counting. It is completely impossible, uncomprehendable, to conceptualize the numbers we're talking about. We're sitting here, floating in a seeming infinity, trying to understand it. But how could we with just our mammalian brains? That is why when I hear people talk about the boundaries of our universe, I get deeply skeptical. The universe, just like the word atom, has evolved from its original meaning. When once we thought the atom to be the smallest unit of existence, we found smaller realities still. When once we thought the galaxy was the largest structure in existence, we found larger structures still. The idea that human beings are anywhere close to finding reality's limits is absolutely absurd. The problem with putting boundaries on our conceptions of reality is that it limits the human imagination to explore. If one thinks that the Atlantic Ocean is on the edge of the world, they will be unlikely to cross it. And similarly, if we think this universe has a definitive edge, we will be discouraged from ever trying to look past it. When a person thinks they already have the answer to a given question, they lose all incentive to find the real truth. That is why we must be ever critical and ever skeptical of any proposed model of reality. One of the most common ways human beings put self-limiting boundaries on their imaginations is through our primitive conception of origins. Everything in our contemporary lives has a beginning and an end, and so it is thought that this must be true for our entire existence as well. The religious have their creation myths, whether it be the Christian God separating light from dark, or the Aztec god Coatlicue birthing the earth from her womb, but the secular are not free from their own misconceptions as well. We all know of the Big Bang, which is the most compelling explanation of universal origins to date. However, it is important to point out that the Big Bang theory is not a secular creation myth. Many people seem to believe that the theory provides a definitive description of the beginning of existence. This is incorrect. What the Big Bang theory claims is that the universe we observe, as well as the time we observe, began in the moments after the rapid expansion of a singularity. It does not rule out the possibility of there being a measure of time prior to the Big Bang, nor does it rule out the possibility of there being another universe with its own conception of time. In fact, there could be universes that are entirely without time, and use other laws of physics to characterize their existence. Anything is possible. But people have trouble grasping this, because they are raised to accept a paradigm which may not be universally applicable. Too often you will hear people in protest claim that the Big Bang theory is flawed because it proposes that something came from nothing, but this is a complete straw-man argument. In most versions of the Big Bang, it is theorized that all of the present matter and energy in the universe was condensed into a singularity, similar to that of a black hole. This singularity was so powerful that it also contained within it the very fabric of space and time, a fabric Einstein merely called space-time. Never is it declared in definitive terms that this singularity appeared out of nothing. The Big Bang theory takes no stance on where the singularity came from. To characterize our lack of an explanation as a simple admission of nothing is dishonest and only goes to damage the reputation of modern science. What the Big Bang theory does definitely state is that when this singularity ceased to be a singularity, its expansion led to what we would consider the modern universe. Prior to the Big Bang, some scientists speculate a Big Bounce theory, where the universe perpetually expands, collapses under its own weight, becomes a singularity, and then explodes again in another Big Bang. This leads to an endless cycle of Big Bangs and big collapses that have happened thousands, millions, or even infinite numbers of times over again. There is also the idea of M-theory in theoretical physics, where the universe exists on something called a membrane, and floats effortlessly among other membranes in a potentially larger multiverse. If this is true, they propose that the energy required for the Big Bang explosion may have come as the result of a collision of two or more of these membranes coming together. Now, none of these hypotheses surrounding the origins of the Big Bang have the evidence that the initial explosion has, but they go to show that things are not as they seem. Our universe is filled with incredible mystery, and until we find the answers, we are only left to ponder and search. Yet I must ask the reader, what answer would truly satisfy you? If the universe is indeed finite, with a specific size and a clear beginning and end date, what does that mean for the nature of our existence? Is there a void beyond the edge of space? If so, where did that come from? And if the universe appeared suddenly and there was nothing before, how did we make that transition? Or in the converse way, if the universe is infinite and eternal, how can we make a conception of time that is non-linear? How would we begin to grasp causality if there is an infinite number of interactions going on between an infinite number of objects? Neither of these possibilities seems to be comprehensible at the moment. So whether the universe is finite or not, we may be headed towards a grand paradox. There may be answers out there that are so complicated that our brains simply do not have the capacity to understand. With this in mind, we find ourselves particularly lost. No matter what direction you look in this world, whether it be above with a telescope, deep with a microscope, or within through consciousness, you are always going to find an edge to your understanding with which the unknown sits outside of. There has always been a bigger discovery on the horizon waiting to be realized, but until we go out and discover it, we can only imagine. I call this domain of mystery the Great Beyond. What the Great Beyond is the realm of the unknown. It is the subject of our unanswered questions. It is not to say that we know the answer to these questions, but simply that there is indeed an answer. What is beyond the furthest galaxy right now? We don't know. Could it be dark matter? Potentially. Could it be a tiny speck of dust? Potentially. Could it be a parallel universe? Potentially. But there is something, even if it's an empty void. The premise of the Great Beyond is derived from the understanding that most of our historical boundaries have been illusory. The sea was not seated upon the edge of the world. The galaxy was not the only body in existence, nor was the atom its fundamental unit. Every time we've put a boundary on something so far, it has turned out to be faulty. So far, there has always been something on the other side. And in this way, we should look towards these unknown horizons as the motivation to uncover new truths. We need people to ponder images of what lays beyond our current view, for the hypotheses formed during this postulation often become the beginnings of our next scientific theories. We absolutely need people to imagine. But the danger always comes when people make the leap from imagining the contents of the Great Beyond to outright making claims about it. The reason why I've discussed this in the preceding pages is because I think the Great Beyond was initially what ancient man was trying to describe when he came up with the conception of God. For God is, in the most abstract sense, the answer. He's an explanation for all questions. The Alpha and Omega. The first and the last. God is humanity's way of observing nature's mysteries and then projecting human traits onto it. There are many who critique the idea of the God of the gaps as a simplistic argument that discounts the personal experience of devout worshippers, but it is a hard thesis to refute when one looks at the history of faith. Once it was believed that the source of contagious disease was supernatural, then it was found to be microbial. Once it was believed that the source of earthquakes was supernatural, then it was found to be a product of tectonic shifts. Once it was believed that the source of hurricanes was supernatural, then it was found to be an interaction of wind currents. This slow retreat of religious claims has been occurring since the dawn of science, and by the time of the 19th century our discoveries were becoming incredibly personal. No longer could it be argued scientifically that human beings were created by God. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution demonstrated that humans evolved by means of natural selection, and that our species was but one branch in the evolutionary tree. A monumental fossil record was uncovered, which traced the roots of this tree all the way back to life's primordial origins some 4 billion years ago. Those who wished to remain consistent with science were forced to admit that their creation myths were no longer supported. However, there was still a gap in our knowledge the creationists could exploit. This was the origin of the Earth. People pointed to the apparent complexity of our world and cited it as evidence of an intelligent designer. For many decades there was no secular explanation to refute this. But then there was. We discovered that the high density and immense mass of gas clouds can occasionally lead to a nuclear reaction that catalyzes the formation of stars. These stars then use their sheer immensity to establish a gravitational pull and coalesce the remaining dust particles into unique cosmic bodies known as planets. With this in mind, it was apparent that another concession to science had to be made, and the religious paradigm was growing ever threatened. At this point the proponents of God had to insert their creator billions of years back even before the Earth, to find a gap in our knowledge where it would be safe to assume God's presence. They claimed that the galaxies before our eyes must have come from somewhere, and what other explanation could suffice other than a divine creator? This was then quickly dismissed by the Big Bang theory. Now the creationists in the modern day have a difficult decision to make. They can either reject the current discoveries of science which give us a naturalistic explanation of both our cosmic and evolutionary origins, or they can assert that these discoveries were God's plan all along, and that He is the one who set them in motion, in times so far back that we cannot yet disprove it. Either way, the survival of their belief is predicated on there being a gap in our knowledge from which they can exploit. Notice religion is always making concessions to science. Science, on the other hand, is never making concessions to religion. The modern concept of God is, as it has always been, the personification of the great beyond. It is a way of trying to understand that which we do not understand, and assigning what we'd like to be true rather than what is true onto reality. People are so desperate to cling to the notion of God that they will stretch its definition to be literally everything. There are some who now say God is the universe, God is consciousness, or God is love. Others use heavily jargon phrases to try and sound scientific, such as Deepak Chopra's famous quote, "God is the superposition of possibility." There are also fraudulent self-help gurus such as Jordan Peterson who will give vague definitions such as, "God is that in which you manifest necessary faith," as if faith were necessary. The point is that if you severely change the definition of God in order to make the word into something that is completely common like love, consciousness, or the universe, then yes, God is real. But you have also just rendered the word completely meaningless and made it basically impossible to use in discussion without confusing people. If I, for example, change the definition of Bigfoot from a mysterious ape man to George W. Bush, then yes, Bigfoot would be real too. I could go around telling everyone I discovered him. But my personal definition of Bigfoot is not what the majority of the world is talking about when they say Bigfoot. So to change the definition of a word, and then act as if my discovery of the word under its new definition is revolutionary, is completely dishonest. If you want to use the word God to describe phenomena that are totally natural and unconscious by nature, then be my guest. I would just urge against it because the word has intense historical baggage that will likely confuse any reasonable person you talk to. The great beyond, on the other hand, is the word I use because it is just that, a mystery. It doesn't have any historical context with something specific. It's not even something you can take a position on. It is simply a frontier that I and many others want to explore. If we could be honest with our admission that we don't know the answers to life's mysteries, and that we are willing to search with an open mind, the dialogue around truth and science would be much better. We would be able to say that perhaps things like the Big Bang, consciousness, or the foundations of matter have a supernatural origin, but that it is unlikely that this is the case given what we know about the universe. We could point to the historical trends that show us moving towards naturalistic explanations and away from supernatural ones. We could also make the honest admission that to be consistent with the principle of skepticism, we must be open to the idea of anything. However, there is one piece of information that does give me pause on the use of the term God. It is a detail of our universe that often makes me question the validity of terms like fate and destiny as well. To put it very simply, I'm talking about the set of descriptions we call the laws of physics. Why is it that the universe has rules to begin with? Why does it have a consistency we can follow? Has it always had these rules? Or do they change with time? Can we bend the rules? Did someone write the rules? Are there other regions of space with different rules? To give an example of this observed consistency, consider the rate of motion of a falling object. Under the conditions of Earth's gravity, a dropped object will fall and accelerate at a rate of 9.8 meters a second per second. This has been demonstrated thousands of times on the Earth, and is true even inside vacuums. The basic rate of acceleration has always stayed the same. And why is this? Why couldn't it be 9.8 meters one day and 27.6 the next? Why couldn't the laws of thermodynamics shift on a Friday and then be totally different by Tuesday? These are the sorts of things that give off a sort of order in our universe that is hard to comprehend. Usually, the proponents of faith attack scientists for portraying our universe as random or merely the product of an accident. But if the material of this universe truly follows deterministic patterns, then we do not live in a random space at all. Our lives are not accidents, they are the result of a causal chain of events that dates all the way back to at least the Big Bang, if not further. And if this is true, is it not a sort of fate? It doesn't mean it has to be fate with a specific intention. It can be directionless. But nonetheless, what is this strange phenomenon we're observing? There are some who believe that science is on the verge of discovering a theory of everything. An explanatory model of our universe that not only unifies the fields of classical and quantum physics, but one that explains the mechanics of our cosmos clearly in its entirety. If such an explanation were to be found, what would we call this perceived order? Would we attribute religious value to the observed symmetry and consistency of our cosmos? I know there are some who will be tempted to label the natural cause of our existence God, but what is the point of labeling something God if it has no conscious thoughts or intentions towards you? The astrophysicist Carl Sagan put it best when he said, "The idea that God is an oversized white male with a flowing beard who sits in the sky and tallies the fall of every sparrow is ludicrous." But if by God one means the set of physical laws that govern the universe, then clearly there is such a God. This God is emotionally unsatisfying. It does not make much sense to pray to the law of gravity. If it were true that such a unifying force existed in this universe, it would still not be a worthy recipient of our worship. Praying to the laws of physics would be like thanking the sun for coming up. The sun has no intention to come up, it simply does. We can draw benefit from nature's present course, but it does not mean nature bears us in mind, nor should we take part in degrading praise or servitude in response. Yet is worship ever justified? What if, contrary to all evidence, there were a divine being who made us all? What if there was an eternal eye watching over everyone's lives? Would it be right to worship him then? I think a good way to describe this dilemma would be to use the analogy of parents. Your biological parents, in the most literal sense, made you. It was through their sexual acts that your mind and body were formed. For this reason, you may have great reason to be thankful for them. However, your parents have no absolute right to own you. It may be wise to obey their wisdom and emulate their character as you learn and grow, but this is assuming they have good intentions. If your parents are instead abusive or neglect you or endanger you or enslave you, you would be right to leave them. By rejecting their overbearing presence, you are exercising your natural right to free expression and self-dignity. So, being sympathetic to a potential creator could be justified if that being's intentions were pure. But the gods of traditional religion have always been far from pure. The god of the monotheisms is often totalitarian, and the gods of the various polytheisms are often selfish and chaotic. Take the Abrahamic God, for example. The God in which all Muslims, Jews and Christians claim to worship. This male entity is the epitome of the abusive lover. He claims to love and cherish his creations, yet routinely inflicts pain upon them for any perceived slight. He promises people the most elaborate pleasures in return for their worship. But if they disobey and refuse him, they are condemned to an eternity of torture. This is the most horrendous flex of power ever conceptualized by a human being. And there is absolutely no escape to it. Worse yet, the victims of this mentality develop a perverse form of Stockholm syndrome. They come to believe they deserve God's punishments because of their own inherent sinfulness. Yet if the act of original sin were true, which it is not, who would be responsible for this act? Surely not the individuals who were victims of circumstance. It would have to be the individual who set the conditions for sin in the first place. Remember that if God did indeed put the laws of physics in motion, then he is responsible for every preference and decision that develops in our minds. If we take part in violence, it is because he invented aggression. If we take part in theft, it is because he invented envy. Our brains follow the same causal chains as anything else in the universe. So if there is an Abrahamic God who set the universe in motion, then he is solely responsible for every bad thing that has ever happened. When a hurricane devastates a coastal community, it is because he's allowed it. When an outbreak of smallpox hits a poor village, it is because he has let the disease form. None of this should be internalized as a personal failure of our own, nor should it be viewed as a just punishment for our imperfections. God is supposed to have put us in this predicament of life, yet he takes absolutely no responsibility for the things that occur as a result. Why should we blame ourselves when we have no control over the laws that dictate our destiny? The Abrahamic God claims to have made us with these innate desires, then punishes us for acting on them. Such a God is not moral or holy. Such a God is a cruel and perverse creature. The guilt believers have been made to feel for their own basic nature is entirely unwarranted. Think of all the sexually curious couples who have been made to loathe themselves for acting outside the confines of marriage. Think of all the homosexuals who fear endless torture for the crime of simply being themselves. Think of all the children who have risked ostracization from family and friends for daring to have beliefs that go against the prevailing dogma. This is what belief in God does. It perverts morality, undermines reason, divides communities, instills unwarranted guilt, and conditions one to the authoritarian mindset. In this way, worship can never be justified, because the legitimacy of God has failed to be established factually or morally. Not only does he not exist, it would be a terrible thing if he did. The late Christopher Hitchens once compared the kingdom of heaven to a totalitarian state, saying, "Religion is a totalitarian belief. It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep, who can subject you to total surveillance around the clock every waking and sleeping minute of your life before you're born, and even worse, and where the real fun begins, after you're dead. A celestial North Korea. Who wants this to be true? Who but a slave desires such a ghastly fate?" Through this reasoning, one can understand that even a conscious and calculating God would be an unworthy recipient of worship. The only conclusion that can be justified both factually and morally in terms of God is that of rejection. Religion is an indefensible position. Yet many still find themselves lost in this rejection of God. If I am not religious, then what am I? They ask. Am I atheist? Agnostic? Secular but spiritual? How do I describe myself? Many people reject these terms because they still want to maintain membership in the identity groups associated with religion. Others simply do not want to adopt another label that associates them with people who may have less than ideal reputations. However, it is important to point out that most of the terms we use to describe lack of faith are not mutually exclusive. Take agnosticism, for example. Agnosticism is simply an admission of uncertainty. It is a way for people to say that they do not know the answer to the question of God, and are happy to leave their conclusion at just that. This makes agnosticism perhaps a pointless word, for in the truest sense none of us know if God exists with certainty, not the theist or the atheist. The only real difference between an agnostic and anyone else is that they will openly admit their uncertainty. Atheism, on the other hand, is something more. It is the admission of uncertainty as well, but it is also the clear lack of faith in any sort of God. The difference between not knowing and not believing is very slim. But atheists really boil it down to a matter of evidence. Is the claim of God supported by empirical phenomena, or is it not? By rejecting God, they are merely applying skepticism to the question of God as consistently as they would to anything else. To quote Carl Sagan again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in this way, the burden of proof on the faithful is extremely high. It is not so much that atheists deny the possibility of God's existence. It is merely that they don't accept any claim wholeheartedly until that position is supported. This is why atheism is not considered a philosophy, but instead a lack of one. The true philosophy of the non-believer is skepticism. But as long as we live in a culture where religious belief is assumed by the broader society, atheism is a word that we will continue to need and use. Anti-theism, in addition to both of these, is very much the admission of uncertainty and the lack of belief in God, but it is also an objection to theism on moral grounds. While many can hold a lack of belief in God and still wish it to be true, anti-theists do not. They consider all the traditional claims of God to be immoral and detestable, and hope that no such entity exists to suppress them. They consider religion to be a dangerous and intellectually toxic force on this earth, and have plenty of evidence to back it up. For this reason, one can be agnostic, atheist, and anti-theist without any sort of contradiction. They cannot believe, object on moral grounds, and still say at the end of the day they do not know, without falling into hypocrisy. In this way, the perceived trichotomy between the terms appears to be illusory. We should all be non-believers in at least one of these ways, unless a monumental discovery is made that usurps everything we know about reality. However, giving up on the notion of God is not the same as giving up on the notion of the profound. The secular worldview has its own conceptions of awe-inspiring transcendence. They are simply found in different ways. People often cling to their faith because there just has to be something bigger than us out there, and what science is here to tell us is that there is a bigger something. That something is the immensity of the cosmos. It is the order of physics that allows us to be here and shapes our very lives. It is the mystery that lays beyond the furthest stars. It is the hidden microscopic world beneath our fingertips. It is the majesty of consciousness that sits behind our eyes. We do not know the answers to life's greatest questions. But what we should trust in wholeheartedly is that there is an answer to be found. What we do with this understanding is up to us. If we insert God into the gaps of our knowledge, we may find comfort for a time in this satisfactory lie. But it will also halt our motivation to find the true answer. Instead, what we should do is acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge and use them as motivation to dream. Our dreams is what we should be pursuing. Something to strive towards. Something to experience and discover. That should be the main course of mankind. To answer our greatest questions and find fulfillment in their answers. It may not seem like a tangible project now. But I assure you, stepping onto that first foreign planet, flying deep into a nebula, looking out into an immense cosmos that seems to never end, these things will be just as spiritual as stepping to the gates of heaven or flying in a golden chariot. Having the breathtaking privilege of being part of that next quantum discovery, or experiencing the eureka moment of alien contact, these things will give us all the wonder and majesty we have been traditionally promised by religion. The contemporary God of religion is false. As Nietzsche put it, he is dead. But the great beyond and all its wonders still remains. Chapter 11: Life at its fullest. What is it that motivates a human being? What is it that drives us to persevere through struggle even when conditions are poor and hope looks bleak? Each of us has our own unique explanation for why we do the things we do. However, when you look at our species in the aggregate, it becomes obvious we're responding to cues that are innately biological. Naturally, our mammalian brains drive us to avoid that which causes suffering, and pursue that which promotes well-being. It's why we avoid hunger and seek food. It's why we avoid loneliness and seek connection. It's why we evade the harsh elements and seek shelter. Human beings are naturally driven to do what's necessary to survive. Our reward system has carefully evolved over the eons to help us navigate through life's challenges and unpredictable conflicts. We're all pursuing happiness in one way or another, even if we're not conscious that we are doing it. The supposedly selfless, for example, who donate to others and devote their time to righteous causes, are still motivated by an internal sensation of justice or fairness. Those who take part in unsatisfying wage labor are delaying their present satisfaction for an eventual happiness brought about by a future paycheck. Even those who enjoy masochistic sex kinks are experiencing pleasure simultaneous to their pain. So while it is true that humans have individual drives and goals, what we share in common is a need to pursue happiness. A drive to trigger our reward system and satisfy our most innate needs. Since happiness is so crucial to everything we do, we should take a moment to examine what it is and why it's so important. Happiness is an experience. It's a positive human emotion. Not only is it a state of mind where one perceives a sense of enjoyment, it is a physical state produced internally by our own neurochemistry. When we take part in actions which are considered enjoyable, our body releases neurotransmitters which result in physiological responses. This might mean a dose of oxytocin when we are intimate and in love. It might mean a surge of dopamine when we consume delicious food and drinks. It might mean a wave of endorphins when we exercise. Whatever the case may be, happiness is just as physical as it is experiential. It is a product of our brain just like our thoughts, memories, and sensory experiences. Yet if happiness is ultimately the goal of our endeavors, why not just cut out the middleman and trigger the response immediately? Why seek to live a better life when you can just instigate the chemical response manually? In a way, we already do this. It's what drugs and alcohol are for. When you make the choice to consume a mind-altering substance, its composing particles mimic the neurotransmitters in your brain. It is in this way that the substances can produce their euphoric and psychedelic effects. Whether it's the drink you have at the bar, the cigarettes you get at the gas station, the antidepressants by your psychiatrist, or the opiates by your doctor, you are taking a substance to achieve artificially what the body does naturally. If it's really this easy though, one might ask why we're not all hopeless drug addicts. If all there is to happiness is the stimulation of sensual pleasure, why not consume every intoxicating substance you find? The reason why we consider addiction to be bad is because at the same time the drug is helping you, it is also hurting you. Simultaneous to the joyous sensations, you risk your brain cells dying, your organs becoming strained, your flesh being pumped with dangerous carcinogens, and your sensory receptors being damaged. Whatever the case may be, in addition to the positive experiential effects of a high, drugs bring with them negative physical effects which have long-term consequences. This is not to say that one should never consume intoxicating substances, nor is it to say that all drugs are equally risky. It is merely to say that making these chemical changes comes at a cost, and that for most, long-term use is a net negative. However, what if there was another way to achieve happiness by looking within? One that did not require an intoxicant, nor a foreign substance of any kind. There are some who argue this method already exists. It's called meditation. A practice which seeks to change the mind's relationship to thoughts through deep focus. Meditation is a hard subject to talk about because of the variety of different types, but let's identify a few characteristics which are common to most practices. The first is a sense of heightened awareness. As you probably already know, the body has both conscious and unconscious functions. When you choose to grab a glass of water or open a book, you are making an intentional decision which you are consciously aware of. Yet there are other functions such as your heartbeat, your insulin secretion, and your antibody production which are entirely unconscious. Not only do you have no control over them, you are often unaware they are taking place. When trying to increase one's awareness, meditators typically begin by focusing on the breath. This is because the breath is both a conscious and unconscious function. You can consciously control your breath by adjusting its speed or holding it, but if you go to sleep or merely stop paying attention to it, it will continue performing unconsciously. For this reason, breath is a useful tool for deep introspection. It is the doorway between two worlds. A way to help calm and relax unrecognized tension in the body. Breath is a very easy thing to focus on. And just as one can learn to control their breath, they can learn to control their attention too. It might start off difficult, as it is with any sort of exercise, but over time one's attention can be strengthened like a muscle or tendon. When I was taught meditation, I was told not to worry about perfection. A wandering mind, they assured me, was inevitable. But that if I recognized my lapses in attention and readjusted each time, I would eventually become better at whatever I was practicing. Eventually, this came to be the case, and over time I learned to increase the duration of my focus for longer periods of time. All of this may seem tedious and not related to the topic at hand, but there is a way in which attention affects our happiness. We all suffer from not being able to live in the present moment. Our pain stems in large part from dwelling on the past and dreading the future. If one can focus on the present, even for a short period of time, these plaguing thoughts cease. Even in situations where the present is miserable, the ability to focus your attention elsewhere can make unavoidable pains far more bearable. By turning off unpleasant thoughts, so to speak, through attention readjustment, you bring your mind to a gentle halt. One cannot stress about a problem if they are not thinking about it. And in this way, thoughts that persistently bother a person can be temporarily silenced, giving them a measure of much-needed peace. In the Buddhist teaching known as the Four Noble Truths, it is stated that much of our suffering stems from desiring things we can't have. Everything in life is temporary, and so even that which we can acquire eventually will part from us. The pain of separation, loss, and disappointment can be unbearable at times. Which is why some Buddhists have identified attachment, along with expectations, as being major contributors to daily suffering. It is by freeing oneself from such habits, they argue, that one reaches a greater peace. Yet Buddhists don't solely focus on negative emotions and their remedies. They also spend a lot of time directing their attention towards life's joys. Love, fairness, and non-violence, among others, are virtues considered important to an ethical lifestyle. By focusing on pleasant subjects, no matter how briefly they last, and seeing the good in all that occurs, one opens their eyes to the bright side of life and the redeeming qualities of those around them. Now, it is doubtful that one could permanently reach such a perceptive state, just as it is doubtful that one could be permanently happy, permanently sad, or hold any emotional state indefinitely. Yet let's imagine for a moment they could. What would it be like if someone could truly live in the moment, not dwelling on the problems of the future or the past? What if they could stoically focus their attention away from issues beyond their control? If they could release themselves from personal attachments? If they could focus on love and gratitude and all the pleasant emotions of life? If this was possible, they would be reaching a psychological state which the Buddhists call nirvana, a transcendent state in which there is neither suffering, desire, nor sense of self. Clearly, no one has ever been able to reach this state completely, but it is reasonable to believe that some have come closer than others. In this way, meditation and the religions associated with it have been a source of liberation for millions of people. Some have dedicated their entire lives to reaching the bliss that nirvana promises, and while I think some of these states of mind are possible, I must ask, would you really want to? You see, the negative and positive emotions experienced by our nervous system were made to motivate certain kinds of behavior. Happiness was evolutionarily coupled with adaptive behavior and sadness with maladaptive behavior. Yet if these emotions are to be decoupled from any tangible goal to the point where one can be content sitting in a cave, is this a life worth living? What's the point of being happy if you never do anything with it? It is true that what makes us happy is complicated, and sometimes we can't achieve it. The Buddhists were correct in identifying that desire creates suffering. The important point to add, however, is that desire also produces unbelievable joy when it's fulfilled. While I think meditation can be a profoundly beneficial exercise, I don't think achieving nirvana should be the goal of our lives. I want suffering within reasonable limits, in order to motivate me towards my goals. I want attachment to the people I love, even if it causes suffering when I lose them. I want desire, lust, ambition, and curiosity, because even though these emotions bring with them the potential for disappointment, they also bring the potential for great fulfillment too. Now, a lot of you may be reading this and saying, this is easy to write from a place of privilege, but if the author was suffering the way others have, he would be begging for nirvana. And this is true. If I was facing extreme hardship, I would use meditation, drugs, and any other outlet I could to bear the unavoidable suffering of my life. However, my life is not unbearably bad, and I don't want to be stuck in an uneventful tranquility either. I want to ride the roller coaster of human emotion. I want to experience the highs and lows of the human condition. I want to live life to the fullest. And I suppose a question worth examining is, how does one go about living life to the fullest? I first came to think about this question while listening to a lecture George Lucas gave for a documentary called Project Happiness. In the lecture, he explained that there are two kinds of happiness, pleasure and joy. Both are important to our well-being, but they have different characteristics. Pleasure is a positive sensation that is physically intense but quickly dissipates. It is the taste of sugary foods, the orgasm during sex, the guilty thrill when you buy something. Pleasure is an emotion that is more immediately satisfying than joy, but it must be replenished constantly or else it disappears. Take ice cream, for example. When you lick an ice cream cone and taste the sweetness, you are enamored in sensation. However, the second you swallow that ice cream, the pleasure is gone. In order to get more pleasure, you have to take another lick, and this goes on until the ice cream is gone or you become physically unhealthy. Similarly, when one drinks every night, they build a natural tolerance to alcohol. It gradually takes more of the substance to sustain the same buzz and eventually develops into an addiction. Joy, on the other hand, is different. It is an emotion that's not as immediately satisfying as pleasure, but it lasts. If pleasure is an explosion of gasoline flames, joy is a slow-burning candle. Meaningful examples of joy include the heartfelt feeling you get when you see a sunset, the love you have for your parents, the sense of satisfaction you experience when you accomplish a fulfilling goal. Joy is not as physically intense. It won't cause you to moan or shout or shake physically in euphoria, but it's something that will be there with you long after the happy moment has passed. Now, none of this is to demonize pleasure in any way. We don't want to have Puritan sensibilities that deny pleasure or discourage any form of happiness. The only point to be made here is that pleasure shouldn't be the goal of life. One should pursue a joyous goal and use pleasure to complement it. For instance, it might be your goal to drive to the mountains, and if you eat an ice cream cone along the way, it will enhance the happiness of your trip. However, if your life's goal is to eat as many ice cream cones as possible, you will soon find that both your health and happiness quickly diminishes. Our culture loves to recite slogans such as "Live life to the fullest" and "The pursuit of happiness." The problem is that because we confuse these two concepts, the pursuit of happiness becomes the pursuit of pleasure. We end up chasing a form of happiness that is unsustainable, and it creates a hole in our hearts that can't be filled. This is devastating enough when it happens to one person. But what happens when an entire culture makes the pursuit of pleasure its goal? When that happens, you get the culture we see today. A culture of consumerism. A culture of chronic depression. A population struggling to find happiness in the most unsustainable way possible. When you look at the number of addicts in Western society, you can see clearly how this has occurred. We're addicted to food. Whether it's sweet food, savory food, or the convenience of fast food, we are out of control in the way we eat. It's gotten so extreme that obesity and its related illnesses have become the #1 cause of death. We want the unhealthy lifestyle more than we want to live. And it's not just addictive foods we consume, we're also addicted to drugs. Whether it's recreational drugs like tobacco, alcohol, or cannabis, or pharmaceutical drugs like opiates, benzos, and amphetamines, almost everyone you know is on some kind of mind-altering substance for at least part of the day. When it comes to the smart gadgets in our pockets, we're hopelessly addicted to compulsively checking our notifications or promoting our digital reputations. We're also addicted to possessions, working longer hours to buy flashier vehicles and larger houses. While the analogy is not as direct, you could say that our institutions are also in the thralls of an addictive behavior. Governments want to acquire more political power, which often means depriving their people of basic freedoms. Businessmen hoard more wealth than they could ever need, depriving their employees of living wages. Multinational corporations consume resources on an unprecedented scale, destroying the environment and the local economy. All of this comes from an addictive mentality. All of this comes from a desire to want more than is sustainable. The question then becomes, why do people live this way? Why do we repeat behaviors which lead to long-term suffering? It's because we're chasing happiness the wrong way. You'd think that in a society characterized by low levels of violence, easy access to nutrition, and substantive civil liberties, people would be unanimously happy, but they're not. We have millions being prescribed psychiatric medicine, and thousands killing themselves. If our culture was such a paradise, it wouldn't be producing so many people trying to escape it. And why is this occurring? Do we not have the means to achieve happiness? Of course we do. The reason we haven't achieved happiness is because we're looking for it in the wrong place. What if, instead of pursuing pleasure, our culture pursued joy? How healthy would our populace be? How fulfilled would our hearts be? One can only imagine the improvements which would result from such a change, but it's undoubtedly clear our world would be better as a result. If our society truly pursued joy, it would put an emphasis on building strong personal connections rather than cynically pitting us against each other. It would value the health and well-being of consumers rather than mass-marketing addictive substances and entertainment devices. It would value a pristine environment rather than treating every landmark as a commodity. And rather than use advertising to undermine our confidence and self-esteem, media would be used to educate and empower people. This is what spirituality should be about. Loving more deeply. Sharing more experiences together. Fostering more community. Seeing with more perspective. When we accomplish meaningful tasks, it brings a level of joy that simple chemical stimulation never could. So let's build this world. A world where not only do we individually choose to pursue happiness, but live in communities that pursue joyous goals too. One where we don't have to self-medicate or enter meditative trances just to feel relief. One where we genuinely thrive. An alternative way of living is possible. A better way even. But only if we re-evaluate what it means to truly be happy. Chapter 12: A Response to Pascal. Blaise Pascal once made the claim that religious belief was warranted, because the consequences of damnation far outweigh the consequences of non-existence. In his mind, the justification for religious belief could be reduced down to a simple calculation. If one believes in God and he turns out to be fake, then there is no afterlife and thus nothing to lose. But if one doesn't believe in God and he turns out to be real, they risk the eternal suffering of hell and have everything to lose. Therefore one should believe in God, for the potential benefits outweigh the nearly non-existent cons. This fallacious calculation is popularly known as Pascal's wager. It is the con that religious people use to intimidate non-believers into accepting their faith. Now there are many reasons for rejecting God, both on rational and moral grounds, but let's consider the idea of a wager for a moment. If one is going to weigh the consequences of a religious life in contrast to that of a faithless life, they must first define which faith they are talking about. There are thousands of different religious groups and denominations throughout the world, each with their own beliefs on afterlife. If we are going to hedge our bets and believe in one specific God, which of the thousands should we choose? Should we choose the Mormon conception of God? If so, why not the Islamic? Why not Zeus? Why don't we put coins on our eyes, so that the Greek deity Charon will give us safe passage through the underworld? Why don't we bury people with their possessions, so that they may have wealth in the afterlife as was believed in ancient Egypt? The truth of the matter is that these thousands of different religious ideologies stand in direct contradiction to each other. To believe in one religion is to violate the rules of thousands of others. We are all deserving of punishment in some other religion's eyes. And since there is no evidence to back up any of them, we find ourselves at a standstill if one were to assume that there is a true religion, and that human beings have crafted it. The chances of you picking the right one would not be 50 to 50, it would be somewhere akin to 0.0001%. And this is of course making the unfounded assumption that any of them are correct. The empirical record we have before us would assume the opposite to be the case. Nearly every falsifiable claim in Scripture has been falsified. And those that are unfalsifiable never had critical backing to begin with. For this reason, faith is unfounded and Pascal's wager is unwarranted. You have no means of hedging your bets if you have no evidence from which to weigh likelihood in the first place. However, people still cling to the notion of Pascal's wager because of their own inherent fears about death. The prospect of hell is so terrifying to them that they cannot help but latch onto an ideology for dear life. In this way, it is shown that Pascal's wager is not only a con but very much an implicit threat. It is stating that if you reject the ideology, you will be tortured forever. Now, is there any reason to believe such absurdities? Absolutely not. Do the Christians cripple in fear over the prospect of the Islamic God coming to punish them? Are Jews struck with terror over the potential of the Hindu God seeking vengeance upon them? Of course not. You can see the faultiness in this logic by the way religious people view other religions. They take their own beliefs seriously, but when it comes to others it is never worth the wager. If a Christian is not willing to convert to Islam in response to the Islamic threat of hell, why should an atheist convert to Christianity in response to the Christian threat of hell? None of these realms of existence have been verified to be real. So, to dictate one's life on an ideology that is just as baseless as all the others is hardly rational. Pascal tells us that a faithless life holds existential risk but that a faithful life holds none. I must push back against this. In fact, I have a wager of my own. It goes a little something like this. What if this life, the one you're living right now, is the only one you'll ever get? What if every moment was temporary and fleeting, and you had to choose what to do with it? What kind of responsibility would that put on you to live a fulfilling life? What kind of pressure would that put on you to stop wasting your time? If you're a rational person, as Pascal likely was, then you know death could come at any time. You could die in a car accident, or be struck by a passing illness. You could be stabbed to death by an unknown assailant, or suffer a heart attack at an early age. You never know when death could be just around the corner. And when that moment comes, you'll wish you had more time. You'll wish that less of your life had been wasted on trivial things, and more had been spent on the things that matter. Now, whether this day comes tomorrow or in 80 years, we all know it's coming eventually. And with this in mind, why wouldn't you live life to the fullest? Why wouldn't you try to have every experience you can? To make the best of this life while you're still living it? Why wouldn't you take that trip around the world? Why wouldn't you try that new and delicious food? Why wouldn't you kiss your lover in the heat of the moment? Why wouldn't you be enamored with taste and texture and love with every facet of your being? Because you have some other duty. Because your life belongs to some higher force, and now you feel you must unnecessarily restrict yourself. What happens when you die and you miss those special moments? What happens when you turn down that job opportunity because you couldn't work on Sundays? What happens when you were unable to consume those delicacies and share those fine drinks because you were following a lifestyle of self-deprivation? What happens when you never pursued the person of your dreams, the one that would have changed your life because you swore a vow of celibacy? What about the kids you never had? What about the family you missed out on? Or even worse, what about the kids you abused because of your obsession with this lie? What about the ones who were denied medical treatment because you believed in faith healing? What about the daughter whose aspirations you squashed because you believed her place was in the home? What about the homosexual relative you demonized and loaded with guilt because of his own innate nature? Think about all the hate and pain you were spreading when you could have been loving. When your life comes to an end, there is no good reason to think you'll get a second chance. That means what you do in these crucial hours means everything. Do you want to look back and realize you wasted your time pursuing something that turned out to be untrue? Would it not absolutely destroy you to realize you had wasted the fleeting hours of your life in such a frivolous way? When the clock is ever ticking and life's moments are passing by, don't be the person who wastes it because you were hopelessly waiting for something better. You have everything to lose by not living your life to fullest. You have everything to lose by adopting an ideology that holds you back from your greatest potential. Something that limits your critical thinking. That restricts the kinds of experiences you can have. That burdens you with guilt. That demonizes your love and aspirations. You have everything to lose by basing your life around a lie. And you have everything to gain by shedding it. Many see faith as an escape from life's harshness. They see it as a means of comfort. A sweet lie to dull the pain and sustain hope in the present moment. But these sweet lies often turn sour with time. These false hopes of salvation inevitably breed complacency. The greatest contributions to our world were not made through aimless wishes nor appeals to divinity. They were made through innovation. People taking it upon themselves to improve the world for the better. Think of our history. There was no amount of good intention or charity in the ancient world that could have cured global hunger or prevented famine. Such disasters were natural and beyond our control. But the modern inventions of industrial agriculture now can. The Haber-Bosch method has allowed us a means of enriching the soil to yield far larger crop outputs than ever before. GMO technology is creating crops that are resistant to both pests and the weather, thereby reducing waste and increasing the number of mouths one can feed. The same historical comparison can be made with the advent of medicine. All the prayer and ritual of our traditional cultures could not have rid the world of disease. But modern germ theory and the innovations of vaccines have wiped out dozens. Smallpox and the measles virus once killed hundreds of millions of humans throughout our history. Now they are nearly extinct. There is no apparent limit, no boundary, on the ways in which science can improve our culture. All these things we now enjoy were produced not by faith but by reason. Reason is the methodology by which we can improve the world. Reason is the thing we use to make our precious moments more enjoyable. So with our limited time on this earth, should we not be dedicating ourselves to the ideals that make our world better? Should we not be avoiding the ideologies that trap us in degrading servitude? Faith is not an escape from life's harshness. It is the thing that perpetuates it. It dulls our pain in the present moment, but pacifies us against worldly horrors. I have no doubt that the sick man on his deathbed takes tremendous comfort in the thought of a heavenly paradise. Just as I have no doubt that the belief in divine intervention has caused many to find strength when they otherwise wouldn't. But what happens when this principle of faith over reason is allowed to dominate the public discourse? That's when you start seeing witch burnings, forced confessions, the purging of intellectuals and dissidents. We wouldn't have to pray in vain for medical relief if the minds studying medicine hadn't been suppressed for their entire history. Nor would present-day stroke patients have to endure their condition if we'd been allowed to freely study stem cells for the last 20 years. The irony is that the source of the faithful's short-term comfort is also the source of their long-term suffering. This is perhaps why Marx called religion the opiate of the masses. An opiate, like any effective drug, dulls one's pain in the present moment while slowly poisoning them from the inside. While one can take pleasure in it for a time, too much of it or too long a duration of its use wreaks horrors on the body. Similarly, our society is drunk off of religion's promises. So much so that we've allowed ourselves to overlook the very things killing us. I once knew a woman who, when asked about climate change, replied, "What's the point in saving the earth if it's just gonna burn anyway?" She was of course referring to the Book of Revelation and God's plan to destroy the world. But think about that for a moment. If you believe not only that the world will end, but that it may even end in your lifetime, where is your incentive to fix it? Likewise, if you believe that this life is trivial and that what really matters is a future afterlife, how easy is it to overlook the suffering of this existence? There are many who lived through arduous times believing that this world was not to be enjoyed. It was to be struggled through so that one might enjoy a future paradise. When these people died, there is no reason to think they were rewarded. Instead, the one chance they had at existence was wasted. Imagine what could have happened if these people had been more concerned with the conditions of their material world. What if the peasants of medieval Europe had risen up against the oppression of monarchy and feudal lords? What if the servants and untouchables of ancient India had overthrown the tyranny of an oppressive caste system? There is so much comfort and relief and fulfillment that could have been experienced in these people's lives, but instead they were tricked into complacency. When Pascal says we have nothing to lose by believing, picture the dying child of smallpox who never grew to adulthood because the church burned doctors for witchcraft. Picture the victims of severe burns and trauma who will never know a normal life because religious conservatives suppress the research of stem cells. Think of every victim of Islamic terrorism and Christian Inquisition that have plagued us to this very day. Picture the European serf, the Indian untouchable, and the African slave, all subjugated due to a belief in divine authority. For them, salvation never came. Their duration on this earth was short and cruel. How many millions of times has this happened? It's perhaps the greatest tragedy of the world. And it is cemented by people's belief in this wretched wager. Human suffering cannot be wished away. Our salvation will not be cast down from above or bestowed to us if we simply wait. Instead, change must come from within. We have it in our mental capacity to overcome any problem we choose, but in order for social innovations to take place, there must be an understanding that no one is going to fix our problems for us. Our suffering is not part of a greater plan, nor is it a punishment for our imperfections. If we want salvation, we must build it for ourselves. And that cannot be done until we overcome religious apathy. Some say that if we're not eternal, then there was no point in ever being. If this life is all that there is, they ask, then what's the point? I find this question to be very insulting, for it assumes that we need divinity in order to have purpose. It robs life's moments of their intrinsic value. To say that life has no meaning because it ends is the same as saying a story is not worth reading because it has a closing. It is like saying a party is not worth attending because eventually you must leave. Life's finality does not in any way devalue it. Instead, it makes our moments more precious. It makes our actions more meaningful. Think of life like a song. A song has both moments of start and finish. But in between the silence, there is an indescribable assortment of complexity and beauty. Some songs are sad. Some are happy. But through the duration of the song, there is an experience of rhythm and order that is absolutely harmonic. One day our song will end, but there is a greater music at play. The material that makes our bodies produces consciousness in the same way an instrument creates sound. And in the same way one instrument can play many songs, our physical universe is an orchestra that has been playing for billions of years. The music doesn't end when our song ends. Instead, the next melody begins. So here is my final wager in contrast to Pascal. By all the evidence we have on this earth, one life is all you appear to get. You get one chance to taste and feel and experience the exhilaration and overwhelming passion of this existence. If you want to throw that away over the unwarranted and microscopic chance that a heavenly dictator will reward you, be my guest. But don't wait to think about this till you're on your deathbed. Consider it now. Consider what it will mean when you look back on your life knowing what you were capable of, and then realizing you spent it in repression. My wager is that a temporary but fulfilled life is far greater than an eternal life of irrationality and servitude. And of course people will still ask, but what if you're wrong? What if God is real and you have to face Him one day? To this I respond, without any guilt or regret. If God is real, and despite all evidence He is here watching and dictating the universe as Scripture says, I will not bow my head or disgrace myself in pitiful submission. I will stand tall and speak to Him man to man. I'll tell Him, I have nothing to repent, for I am just what you made me. You gave me passion. I followed it. You gave me desire. I chased it. You gave me honor, duty, self-respect, and I held to it. But most of all, you gave me the capacity for reason. And I used that reason. I rejected you because you gave me absolutely no evidence. And you are gonna condemn me for this? You are gonna tell me what's moral? Absolutely not. What about the Holocaust, God? What about the Inquisition? What about the communist purges? What about human sacrifice? What about disease? What about natural disaster? What about psychopathy? What about mental illness? And pollution? All of these are things you let happen. You knew God. You put all the conditions in place for these terrors to occur. We are simply the natural result of that. So you're gonna condemn us for the mess you made. You're gonna condemn us for sticking with science and morality and reason. You have no basis to stand on. If you are going to condemn me and the others like me to an eternity of hell, then I go with honor. And unlike you, I can at least say I'll be there with good company. Even if religion were true, which we have no reason to believe it is, it would still be moral to resist it. So with this in mind I say forget about religion and forget about faith. We are free in thinking people, and our lives are our own. No amount of fear-mongering, hedge betting or logical inconsistency is ever gonna change that. And to the reader who is currently pondering this I must now ask, is this wager really a leap of faith worth taking? Chapter 13, Heaven on Earth. I dream of a world in which the troubles of our contemporary age have passed. A world in which the stakes and circumstances of our civilization are not as desperate, for we have averted the disasters that characterize the present. In this world we are no longer in existential crisis, for we have solved climate change. We have disassembled our nuclear arms and ceased the production of biochemical weapons. The oceans are not filthy, for we have cleaned them of trash using a combination of microorganisms and sea drones. And the air is fresh, for we have done away with the combustion engine and all its emissions. Not only is this world cleaner, but it is far more beautiful. Through the innovation of more efficient cities and agricultural planning, nature has been allowed to reconquer most of the countryside. New ethical farming practices have produced livestock without misery. And for most people, livestock is no longer required. The majority of meat is grown in petri dishes that are systematically inspected for cleanliness. Proteins, vitamins and other nutrients can be fed to our cells directly. And when we do wish to physically eat, we can do it lightheartedly, for all human consumption is ethical. Nothing we do inherently requires the suffering of other organisms. And it is not simply our fellow creatures that are free of exploitation in this world. Our fellow human beings have been liberated as well. The rise of automation has led to the gradual easing out of human labor. Specialized machines work all jobs from manufacturing to construction to cleaning. The only jobs that people take part in working are the jobs they choose for themselves. Creative passions are more easily followed, and the luxury to be with one's family is more easily afforded. Money in this case is no longer required, because production rates have drastically outperformed consumption rates. All material items that appear to have some sort of scarcity can be replicated at a molecular level. And things that have more than material value, sentimental items, historical landmarks, scenic property, etc., are allocated by a system of merit. This incentivizes people to better themselves, rather than sit around in mindless complacency. War, too, has been eliminated. Through a combination of economic factors, social factors, and structural interdependency, we humans have chosen a more peaceful path for ourselves. Through the careful moderation of human aggression through genetics, we have caused our levels of conflict not only to decrease but to take on a less violent form. On top of this, a considerable amount of pressure has been relieved off of society due to increased mobility. With the advent of mass public transportation and the abolition of borders, the free movement of people has created more homogeneous societies. People live amongst who they want to live. And for those seeking an escape from society, the open sky ahead of them offers a pleasant alternative. The opening of outer space assures that we will never run out of room for our growing population. Not only will people be open to learn and explore, but they can fly away from the troubles that concern a future Earth. I also dream of a broader cosmos that is filled with human colonies. Entire constellations of human creation crafted and terraformed to our liking. Upon these colonies are sparsely populated settlements within a large expanse of nature. These colonies have blue skies, fresh air, and natural mountain ranges all carved out from the design of artists. Upon them there are lush forests, numerous lakes, and all the space in the world for man to live in harmony with nature. Life on these worlds is relatively free. For without war, disease, coerced labor, and the inefficiencies of unjust state institutions, people have the time and resources to pursue their most fundamental passions in life. Time can be dedicated to art, games, dance, the outdoors, sports, hiking, camping, traveling, exploring, and most importantly the pursuit of knowledge and personal development. There really is no limit on what people can do for recreation. Yet I don't want this future life to just be about recreation. Within the communities of the future, I imagine a culturally enforced sense of discipline. One that requires the individual to go out and build and create and achieve, rather decay in sedentary comfort and luxury. In this way, the future life has its own challenges and struggles. They are just of a less pressing character than the problems of today. Most importantly of all, though, I imagine a future where there is true self-actualization for the individual. One where our lives are not tied directly to finding the next meal, or earning a fixed income, or fighting for the sovereignty of a nation-state. Instead, they are for something more. Something deeper and more intrinsic to the individual than was ever thought possible before. In this future, humans will have the time and means to evaluate what their purpose is in this universe. With the tools they develop, they will be able to go forward with full hearts in any direction they pursue. This is my dream. My paradise. My heaven. Yet I know it isn't real. I know that like any utopian vision, it is subject to unconsidered flaws and mistakes. Will there ever be a society that looks quite like this? It's impossible to know. But the drive to pursue one's dreams and make the world a better place is always a worthwhile goal. It should not be ridiculed or dismissed as impossible, for we humans have already achieved what was thought impossible before. As I write this, dreaming of a future utopia, it's important for me to acknowledge that I'm already living in a sort of utopia. The world in which I live is not one without problems, but in comparison to the world of my recent ancestors, it is an absolute paradise. Think about your own life, assuming you live in a first-world industrial country. Just the fact that you can walk down the street and buy food from a grocery store is a marvel luxury. How many millions of desperate hunter-gatherers would have killed, quite literally, for such easy access to food? How many have had to bury their loved ones due to drought and famine? How many have injured themselves trying to wrestle down a large kill? We think of food as a mere commodity in the developed world of the 21st century, but for most of human history, the act of consumption was an intimate struggle for survival. The same can be said of disease. How many millions of disease-afflicted children would have begged for the innovations of vaccines and antibiotics? How many desperate parents would have given anything to be able to rush their children to a local hospital? How many poor victims have had to live with lifelong pain and disfigurement over an injury that could have been repaired with a simple operation? There are now major swaths of the globe where even war is no longer a factor. People can live safely in their homes without the fear of armies pouring in from neighboring towns. The intimate carnage of hand-to-hand combat has vastly dissipated. 15% of prehistoric humans died by violence, while only 0.03% of modern humans do. And if Steven Pinker's analysis in The Better Angels of Our Nature is true, human violence is at its lowest point in history. We are living in the greatest era of cooperation over conflict that mankind has ever known, and we should always cherish that. Not only have socio-cultural innovations enriched our lives, but technological ones have as well. The handheld trinkets we now possess would have once been considered godly. Think of how difficult it was to summon a flame when all that one had was the sticks and stones of the jungle. How many poor souls have shivered to death amongst the wet and cold with no chance of reprieve? Now we can summon flame at the click of a lighter. And rather than depend on a tent or tree for shelter, our homes have indoor heating, plumbing and sanitation to protect us from the elements. Even more fascinating still, our means of communication have improved. Where once we had to send messages by horse and ship, we can now speak instantaneously across vast distances through little devices in our pockets. We can summon a library's worth of knowledge in a matter of moments, or play an entire orchestra's worth of music without a single instrument. The aspects of modern society that we now consider mundane would have been absolute treasures for most humans throughout history. Not only are we living better than our ancestors, in many cases, we're living their very dreams. Think of all the young children laying in their beds at night who imagined they could fly. How many of them looked up at the clouds and pictured themselves soaring across the sky like the birds? Perhaps they imagined themselves flying off to faraway lands, escaping their troubles as they stared down on an endless landscape. In the 21st century, we have not sprung wings or learned to levitate, but we've done something very close. That image of looking down on an endless landscape is no longer just a dream. It is a reality for millions of people. The invention of the airplane and the helicopter have made it real for us. Now, with just an average month's salary, you can fly halfway across the world. You can take a voyage further than any explorer of antiquity. You can rise to higher altitudes than even the greatest mountaineer. And you can travel to lands that your ancestors never even heard of. Better yet, you can do it all in a matter of hours. This dream that we know was held by untold countless millions is a staple of modern life. It happens so often now that we hardly pay attention when we see people in flying machines passing overhead. Would this not have been an absolute wonder for any kind of ancient society? Imagine being the one to explain it to them. That we did the impossible. We, being the primates that we are, found a way to soar in the skies like the birds. Any previous society would be absolutely awestruck by this discovery. Then imagine telling them that we walked on the moon. Yes, the moon. The moon that people once worshipped. We've walked on the very thing our ancestors called God. Is it not incredible that the species that once prayed to the heavens is now traversing it? There have been countless occasions across history where human beings achieved things that their societies thought were impossible. For instance, who would have believed that a group of poorly trained colonialists and militiamen in 1776 could have taken on the largest empire in history and won? Who could have believed that these same colonialists could have drafted the first constitutional republic based on Enlightenment principles? Similarly, who would have believed that slavery, an institution that existed for thousands of years, would suddenly be abolished by the West in the 19th century? Who would have thought that patriarchy, a system that routinely subjugated women, would be suddenly challenged and diminished during the 20th century? Now it can even be said that smallpox, a disease that once killed tens of millions per year, is no more. The momentum for change is ever growing, and its speed is accelerating before our eyes. If you lived from 1900 to 2000, you would have seen in one human lifetime the population explode from 1 billion to 6 billion, the invention of the plane and the transition from horse to car, the rise of socialism, communism and fascism, the fall of all three, the sexual revolution, the green revolution, women's suffrage and integration into the workplace, the civil rights era, the space race, the creation of the internet, the growth of organized labor, the discovery of genetics, the insights of modern cosmology, the tech revolution and the dot-com boom, and so much more. You would have seen 100 revolutions. 1,000,000 new inventions. The very climate of the earth changed before your eyes. All of these things have happened in the span of a single human lifetime. And as we look to the future, this rate of change shows no signs of slowing down. So with this in mind, it is not possible that we could see similarly radical changes in our own lifetime. Is it not possible that the world could one day overcome the contemporary issues of pollution, exploitation, coercion and mechanized warfare? To travel the stars and be unshackled from the burdens of modern society? Human history shows an overwhelming potential for innovative change. But whether we fulfill that potential is entirely dependent on our efforts. This is why you should chase your dreams. This is why you should strive to build a better world. Because even if you don't live to see it, that better world can be achieved. History shows us that our efforts can pay off. And while one can point out the imperfections of the modern world and scoff at the notion of progress, understand that these differences across time, even marginal ones, mean the world to those who have been liberated. Every extra person that eats who otherwise would have starved is a success worth cherishing. Every extra person who gets treatment who otherwise would be sick is a wonder to behold. Each additional life we improve even slightly is a worthwhile goal in itself. And with the trends we're talking about here, we have the potential to improve literally billions of lives. Yes, we will probably never live in a perfect world. But perfection shouldn't be the goal. Improvement should be the goal. Elimination of extreme suffering should be the goal. I don't want to live in a world where there is no adversity. I just want to live in a world where the adversity is bearable. Consider the adversity experienced when exercising. Whether you are lifting weights or doing long-distance running, there is a certain resistance your body feels when confronting a physical challenge. If the resistance is too high, you'll tear your muscles and shatter your bones. But if the resistance is reasonably moderate, you will grow healthier and stronger when you overcome it. This is what I want for human life. Not a world that is without challenge, but a world where those challenges inspire us to excel rather than leave us dead or traumatized. When the Founding Fathers of the United States drafted the first secular constitution in history, they contributed to human progress in a substantial way. One would think that in modern times we'd be constantly praising them for their efforts, but too often this is not the case. Many consider the founders to be hypocrites because they were not consistent in applying their universal principles to all. Thomas Jefferson may have wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal," yet he still owned slaves. Women did not have equal rights in the society, nor did indigenous people, African Americans, or any other kind of minority group. The American Revolution did not solve all of society's problems. However, it still did something that I would argue is worth celebrating. It created the idea of the citizen. An individual bestowed with unalienable rights which the government was constitutionally bound to protect. Historically, it was only the aristocracy who had rights. The kings, lords, nobles and masters could pretty much use those who served under them as they wished. Then a group of Enlightenment thinkers created a system where citizens had a right to property, a fair trial, a vote, and the ability to speak freely and defend themselves. Over time, this idea of what qualified as a citizen was expanded to include more and more of our fellow humans. We got the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the abolitionist movement. These successes were all possible because the Founding Fathers included the addition of the amendment. The idea that unlike the constitutions of other countries, its foundational principles could change. Americans could strive to be a more perfect union over time and generation. And strive for a more perfect union we did. Nowhere in this principle does it conclude that one generation solves all problems. Rather, it is a continual, dialectical process where each generation strives to leave their society better than when they found it. Now we can argue in the modern day about whether the United States has actually made itself a more perfect union. But it is undeniable that an attempt is being made. The activists on the streets striving for racial equality, the end of labor exploitation, and the end to unnecessary war are doing so because they want to bring progressive change. And if we can strive to make our country a better place to live in, could we not also do the same for the world? The only danger that arises from this kind of thinking is when one decides the only way to achieve their ideal society is to force it on others. We see this with both religious and materialist ideologies alike. Their utopian visions are quite specific and must be strictly enforced. There is a need for purity and conformity to an ideology, and when such principles are required, purges are the natural result. Any movement that has no room for dissenters, free thinkers, and people who just want to be left alone is a backward ideology. And historically, we know that those who have tried to force a utopia on the world almost routinely bring about a dystopia. This is why how we change the world is just as important as what we change it into. If our methods are authoritarian and our vision is fixed and inflexible, then we deserve to fail. But if our methods are through inspiration, persuasion, and the rigors of free inquiry and open debate, then we may have something positive to contribute to the world after all. The other thing we must recognize is that human beings aren't perfect creatures. We are a species of primate. One whose sensory organs cannot perceive most of what occurs in the natural world, and even to the extent we can, we have a hard time grasping it. Our brains are neither large enough nor equipped with the nutrients to process all the stimuli our body receives. For this reason, we filter out most of that which does not directly contribute to our survival. This act of simplification, of reducing our uber-complex world to a set of perceptions we can grasp, is essential to living and operating as a sane human being. However, it is important to understand that because we reduce reality for pragmatic sake, we are not getting a full picture of the world we live in. Human beings are creatures of flesh and blood just like every other animal. This makes us prone to mistakes, misperceptions, and biases. The way to overcome this, though the problem of human imperfection cannot be fully overcome, is to be skeptical and critical of all ideas and worldviews. There is no one person that is correct about everything, nor one group that is consistently right. So in efforts to improve the world, it is best to include as many diverse voices and opinions as possible. By pointing out the flaws in each other's arguments, we move closer to something approximating truth. It would be nice if we had an easy solution which could account for all of life's complexities, but no such solution exists. Any ideology which markets itself as a fix-all solution for our political, economic, scientific, our cultural problems should be avoided. Only an ever-growing, ever-changing model of the world has the intellectual honesty and flexibility to address the problems we face. In this way, one finds themselves in a war on all fronts. A recognition that all sides must be criticized, even one's own. In fact, I would argue that one's own beliefs should be criticized more than others, because the beliefs you already hold are the ones mostly likely to get past your filter. This may be hard in many circumstances, because communities are often held together by a shared ideology or belief system. To criticize a group's ideology may be perceived as an attack on its individual members, which is why it is important that we build communities where ideological conformity is not required. If critics have to risk ostracization just for speaking openly, their organizations will be less likely to know when they're making a mistake. There have been too many times when horrors have been allowed to unfold because those with knowledge were unwilling to speak out against what was popular. All of us, as free-thinking individuals, should be willing to risk this ostracization. The truth is simply too important to be left unexamined. But then the question becomes, what is the point? What is the point of struggling if we never get a final peace? Why should one risk their life and happiness to solve a social problem, if the next generation is only going to receive their own? I think often about the soldier who fights for their country, only to have another war spring up in the next generation. What's the point in fighting if the fighting never stops? I also think about parents working hard to give their children better lives than they had, only for their children to encounter new problems they hadn't anticipated. What is the point of our hard work if we can never reach perfection? The reason why we do this, why we struggle for progress even if it is temporary, is for the moments it provides us. What I have come to find is that heaven, paradise, utopia, whatever you want to call it, it's not a place. If I may be so cliché, it is a state of mind. It's a moment where one is safe and secure, happy and healthy and otherwise free. One where your heart is content and you feel as though you belong. For me, heaven is camping by a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and witnessing all the life and landscape. Heaven is watching the sunset on the Maui shoreline and the timeless bliss it instills. Heaven is floating effortlessly down the Snake River in the peak of summer. Or to be more general in my terms, heaven is every night you go to bed with a full stomach and a peaceful mind. Heaven is having your loved ones with you when the day is otherwise stressful. Heaven is every moment you walk this earth free of disease, free of violence and free of coercion. That is what heaven is. And the reason I feel so confidently that it can be achieved is because I've experienced it, even if it's just for a short amount of time. Since we know that life is finite and it will inevitably come to an end, these precious moments matter. My goal is not to build a utopia where nothing goes wrong. Nor is it to be an elitist snob who thinks they knows what's best for everyone. My goal is to take those little bits of paradise that I have just described and increase their frequency in my life and the lives of others. By doing this, even slightly, I am participating in a chain of events that goes back thousands of years. We cannot repay our ancestors for all the pains it took to get us here. We can only pay it forward. And so with gratitude for all that we currently enjoy, we must pay it forward, preserving the moments that make life worth living in the process. Chapter 14: Avoiding Armageddon. There is a reason I criticize religion more than other ideologies, and it's not because they aren't as dangerous. The reason I criticize religion in particular is because generally it is the first place people learn to believe things without evidence. Not only is faith an acceptable way of thinking in religious circles, it is considered a virtue. Something to be encouraged rather than avoided. Something to be praised rather than shunned. This is clearly a problem because it has downstream effects in our culture. If one can choose to suspend their critical thinking when it comes to religious matters, why wouldn't they do the same when it comes to politics? Or their economic views? Or their opinions on social issues? Why wouldn't superstitious thinking plague their careers? Or their medical decisions? Or the way they raise children? Once irrationality is deemed socially acceptable, there's no telling what negative consequences it will have. As the Spanish painter Francis Goya once said, the sleep of reason produces monsters, and by teaching our children to put their reason to sleep we are inadvertently making their minds vulnerable to future delusion. Imagine instead a world in which we don't indoctrinate children from a young age. A world where spiritual topics are seldomly discussed until students are old enough to evaluate the evidence for themselves. If religion was not presented to people until an intellectually mature age, would anyone accept it? Would any person literate in biology believe the tale of a talking snake? Would any person educated in physics agree with the claims of a young Earth? It might seem harmless to entertain a little mysticism on a Sunday morning, but understand that the beliefs we hold influence our actions. As we speak, the technological power of our species grows. This means that the repercussions of believing false information have greatly amplified. For instance, if you believe God controls the weather, you might disregard the threats of climate change. If you reject evolution, you might fail to anticipate the mutations of a pandemic-causing pathogen. If you think holy war is a good thing, you might feel reluctant to stop international conflicts. All of these are potential outcomes of falling victim to lies. It is also clear that the positive trends I attributed to technology in the previous chapter can be made to serve evil if they fall into the wrong hands. Our medical technology can be used to make bioweapons. Our green energy technology can be repurposed to make atomic bombs. Even our agricultural breakthroughs can collapse ecosystems if used unsustainably. While it is popular to say, let people believe what they want, it is important that we persuade our peers out of magical thinking, because the consequences of being wrong have never been so detrimental. It matters greatly what those wielding power think, and in this world we all have a little power. This is why it is imperative that the principles of reason be widely accepted. Civilization is fragile, and there are a myriad of ways it could be destroyed, yet when you look at the list of likely perpetrators they generally fall into two camps. Those who have the capacity to end civilization but not the intent, and those who have the intent to end civilization but not the capacity. There is a reason why the United States and the Soviet Union never launched a first strike during the Cold War. To put it simply, they didn't want to die. As evil as communism was, and as sinister a force as Western imperialism was, neither of the nation's leaderships wanted to risk a global extinction event. Surely they wanted to dominate their adversaries and expand their sphere of influence, but when it came to gambling with the lives of every man, woman, and child on Earth, they ultimately said no. We are unbelievably fortunate that the world's nuclear nations have behaved with sufficient safety so far. However, to assume this behavior will continue is to do so at our collective peril. All that would be needed to trigger a disaster worse than 100 holocausts would be for the wrong person with the wrong intentions to be in a position of political power. As long as industrial military institutions exist, they will continue churning out weapons of unimaginable lethality, and as long as these weapons exist, we are all equally at the mercy of those who control them. Now you might be asking, who would be crazy enough to make such a decision? Who would choose to use these weapons knowing it would mean their demise as well? To answer that, we only need to look at recent history. The Columbine school shooters Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold shot 36 of their fellow schoolmates before killing themselves shortly after. This resulted in a series of copycat shootings where deeply disturbed young men attempted suicidal massacres of their own. Nowadays, school shootings are a common part of life in America, and the death toll from their exploits grows higher every day. In the world of religion, we see something similar. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers, killing thousands in an act of violent martyrdom. This too has been followed by waves of subsequent terrorism, with Islamic extremists shooting, bombing, and driving vehicles into an unsuspecting public. The point of these murders, whether they're ideologically motivated or not, is to inflict death and suffering upon others, even if it means the annihilation of the perpetrator. In this way, there are three types of people who pose a uniquely great threat to civilization: the fundamentalist, the hateful nihilist, and the insanity-ridden fool. The reason these individuals are particularly dangerous is because death is not a deterrent for them. Religious fundamentalists don't fear death because they've been told there is a supernatural existence awaiting them. They believe in paradise or reincarnation, or that they're following God's will. If you believe there is a life after this world, it is far easier to throw away your life on something destructive. And if you're willing to disregard your own life so easily, one can only imagine what you might do to others. The hateful nihilists, on the other hand, are different. They have no faith, nor principles, nor ideology of any kind. Their life is devoid of purpose, and their sense of right and wrong is lacking. For them, life is about pursuing their desires and nothing more. And when their minds become occupied with violent, murderous, and self-destructive fantasies, there's no real argument to dissuade them from their course. This relates directly with those who are insane, and depending on their mental condition, may not even understand the damage they're causing. Now, luckily, none of these individuals have a nuclear arsenal at their disposal, but this could change at any time. The United States, which prides itself on its secular form of government, also has a high propensity for theocratic and superstitious thinking. Nearly half of the population rejects evolution, 33% deny anthropogenic climate change, and a growing number dispute the efficacy of vaccines in modern medicine. These beliefs regularly interfere with common-sense health policy and bolster the popularity of politicians with misanthropic views. To make matters worse, among Christians, there is a school of thought known as Armageddon theology, which states that the end of the world described in the book of Revelation is a good thing, and that believers should act in ways that make this future come about. President George W. Bush once said, "God told me to end the tyranny in Iraq," and this means that one of his reasons for prosecuting a war that killed over 1 million people was that he felt divinely inspired. Had the United States elected someone just a little more radical, or a little more sympathetic to Armageddon theology, it's possible our weapons of mass destruction may have already been used. This has a parallel in the Islamic world, where apocalyptic Muslims behave in eerily similar ways to fundamentalist Christians. They too support pseudoscience and theocratic legal systems, and while fringe groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are the most notorious examples of this, it unfortunately applies to nation-states as well. Iran, which to this day is a theocracy, has an active nuclear program. At the moment they are using it exclusively for energy, but there are no guarantees about how long this will last. The widespread Islamic belief in paradise makes jihadism a significant threat. And since their leadership has repeatedly called for the destruction of the West and Israel, we as an international community need to keep an eye on them. One of the most unfortunate aspects of recent history is the return of sectarian violence to the Middle East. As this is being written, proxy wars are being waged with local Shiite militias taking on local Sunni militias for the right of territorial rule in Yemen and Syria. These militias in turn are being backed by Saudi Arabia and Iran, who themselves are engaged in a sinister Cold War. The fear is that as Iran develops its nuclear capacity, Saudi Arabia will do the same. There is some limited evidence this has already occurred, and this is a particularly concerning threat, because Saudi royals in the past have been responsible for funneling money and supplies to jihadist groups. The sympathy for terrorism in the region is simply too high to allow weapons of mass destruction to freely proliferate. And when two well-armed forces share the view that God has blessed their genocidal ambitions and death is no longer a deterrent, the door is open for the worst kind of violence to occur. This could be no more apparent than in India and Pakistan, where both religious tension and nuclear capacity already exists. Hindu nationalists and Islamic chauvinists frequently quarrel over territory and ideology, and if one of them were to choose a violent first strike, the technology is already there to kill hundreds of millions. The world is rife with present-day examples of unchecked fundamentalism, and when we look back at the 20th century regimes that nearly ruled the world, we find something utterly disturbing. Imperial Japan, which routinely launched suicidal kamikaze attacks against its Pacific opponents, also had a biological weapons program. The regime would drop deadly fleas infected with bubonic plague onto Chinese cities, and until 1945 had plans to launch similar attacks on American soil. Adolf Hitler, who was both a fundamentalist and insanity-ridden fool, had Nazi scientists working for him on atomic weapons. When it was decided that the war was hopeless and he would inevitably lose, he ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, not caring for the nation's well-being if it meant striking one last blow at the Allies. Now ask yourself this: what would the Axis powers have done with nuclear weapons? What would they have done with the ability to modify viruses or create natural disasters? In hindsight, no one can know what would have really happened, but considering the high death toll in our timeline, it couldn't have been good. Mass murderers seldomly slowed down when given more efficient tools, and as we look to the present we find those tools are only spreading. In each of these cases, we see how personal decisions nearly led to the destruction of civilization. Had the nuclear-armed regimes been slightly more fundamentalist, there would have been disaster. Had fundamentalist regimes been slightly more nuclear, there would have been disaster. Considering the fact that nuclear weapons have proliferated to 9 different countries, each of which possesses deadly chemical and bioweapons as well, we must seriously consider radical forms of disarmament. These weapons have existed for less than 100 years, and already there have been several close calls which almost resulted in war. From the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to the 1983 Soviet false alarm, how long can this go on before a mistake is made? How powerful can our tools get before they become the ruin of us all? The responsible use of technology is the great imperative of our time. To get this question right is to solve all problems from war to pollution to disease to famine to poor education. The only way it can be accomplished is if everyday people understand the principles of reason. Not just the leaders in office, but the public they're meant to serve. If reason is more widely understood, people will be less likely to subscribe to fundamentalist ideologies. And if secular humanist values are more widely promoted throughout the culture, people will be far less likely to succumb to nihilism. While it is true that we will never be able to completely rid the world of wicked people, we can prevent individuals displaying these traits from being given political and technological power. Understand that Hitler alone couldn't have killed 6 million Jews. It took an obedient population of Germans to follow his orders. Similarly, the 9/11 hijackers could never have killed 3,000 people alone. They needed the assistance of advanced technology to amplify their death toll. If we can manage to prevent world-altering technologies from falling into insidious hands, we may have a planet to enjoy in the coming centuries. Failure to do this, however, could result in a quick end to our species. So, what do we do? It starts with helping everyday people realize their power. In a democracy, this is typically done by exercising the right to vote and protest. However, even in dictatorships, it is ultimately the citizenry who have power. If farmers don't grow food, the regimes are starved. If electrical workers don't perform maintenances, government buildings lose power. If truckers and merchants abandon their routes, cities are cut off from supplies. Even law itself is predicated on enforcement. If enforcement officers in either the police or military choose to be non-compliant, the very foundation of political authority collapses instantaneously. It is only by our consent that leaders rule and systems function. So whether it be strategic voting, mass disobedience, or in extreme cases, outright violence, the people ultimately have the power to stop the world from going to ruin. We have to make sure that no matter what part of the world you're from, no matter what culture you belong to, you oppose the self-destructive use of technology. Our leaders cannot be allowed to destroy the environment. They cannot be allowed to produce ever more powerful weapons that have the ability to wipe out billions. Just as we can use our machines to level cities and wreak havoc on the environment, we can also put them towards the betterment of humanity. Our tools can cure diseases. They can automate jobs. They can educate millions. And produce food in ethically sustainable ways. If we continue to alleviate poverty and child abuse, while strengthening our dependence on international trade and cooperation, it's possible we might even get a world without the kind of violence which currently characterizes it. All of this is achievable if everyday people demand more from their society. It's not at all obvious that we will succeed in preventing the destruction of human civilization. But if we do, it will be because everyday people choose it. What we believe in our minds and feel in our hearts matters. Which is why the topics of meaning, morality, and epistemology are so important to discuss. Our civilization is on the precipice of so many unbelievably beautiful achievements. But if we continue to make self-destructive decisions, we will never live to see them. I personally want to see what the surface of foreign planets look like. I want to be able to tell every cancer patient in the hospital that we have a cure. And so when I'm asked, how do we save the world, my answer is very simple. The way we save the world is by saving our minds first. Chapter 15, In Dialogue with the Faithful. I once had a theology professor who tried to explain to me the value of religion. For this task, he presented me with a parable that had been given to him by another professor in his youth. While I can't remember his parable in its exact words, it went a little something like this. Imagine that a husband and wife are walking along the beach. They are talking, laughing, and playing in the sand, when suddenly the man notices a heart-shaped rock beneath his feet. Intrigued by the rock, he picks it up, examines it, and decides it will make a perfect gift for his wife. In a romantic gesture, he gives it to her and says, "Keep it as a symbol of our love." Then in response she looks at it, wholesomely laughs, and accepts it. At the end of the day they go home. She puts it up by her window and doesn't think about it again for a long time. After that, the couple goes on with their life. They buy a house, raise a family, and live together happily for 40 years. Their marriage is a testament to devotion. There is not a day that goes by where they regret it. However, as the years pass, aging begins to take its toll. The husband's health slowly declines, and one day he suffers a stroke and dies. The wife is in absolute shock by this and is left completely alone to grieve. While she doesn't have her husband with her anymore, she does have his old possessions to remember him by. That heart-shaped rock is still sitting by her window as an everlasting symbol of their love. From then on, she takes the rock everywhere she goes. She holds it with her, as proof that her devotion has not diminished with the simple passage of time. Eventually, though, she starts to grow sick as well. And knowing that her death is coming, she passes down the rock to her eldest son. On her deathbed, she tells him the same thing her husband once told her. "Keep it as a symbol of our love." And the son, moved by her tragic words, accepts the rock without question. From then on, he takes the rock with him everywhere he goes. He associates it with the memory of his parents, and cherishes it with the same sincerity his mother did. Now the rock has taken on a special character. When the son dies, he passes it to his son. Then similarly, that son passes it to his daughter. Soon there is a tradition within the family. The rock is passed from one generation to the next, until the descendants ultimately forget the names of the first ones to hold it. Its symbolism is etched into history, yet no one remembers how it got there. There are so many questions about this rock. Where it came from. What it originally meant. Who started the tradition? But these questions no longer matter. The rock has a sentimental value that transcends its original purpose. It is part of history now. It is ingrained into the culture. So many descendants lay claim to the rock that people actually fight and die over it. There is so much sentimental value packed into this rock. But it is still, at the end of the day, just a rock. It has no more intrinsic value than any other rock on the beach, yet it is somehow more. One could honestly say that at face value this rock is worthless. But to the people who hold it dear, it has all the worth in the world. This analogy matches perfectly with religion, because religion is at face value worthless. In one way it is a false ideology that impedes human reason, yet it carries with it extreme historical, cultural and sentimental value that we would otherwise find positive. Religion encompasses people's hopes and dreams. It creates for them a value system. It helps foster a shared culture. And at times foments acts of love and charity. In this way, religion cannot be merely reduced to a set of ideas or a group of people. Religion is in one sense a community. In one sense a culture. And in one sense an ideology. This is why we must be careful about the manner in which we critique religion. Most of the objective claims in religion are false, as are the moral claims and prescriptive instructions about how to live one's life. However, the culture around religion is far more complicated. Even the biggest atheists can still enjoy religious art, for example. They can marvel at the aesthetic beauty of the Sistine Chapel, or stand awestruck at the vast architecture of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. Similarly, the faithless can be captivated by religious music. They can enjoy the festivities invented by indigenous spiritual traditions, or enjoy the tasteful recipes of the kosher and halal diets. The meditations of Buddhism can leave one feeling refreshed and consoled. And the mythologies of the Hindu and Greek pantheons can be fun to read. There is so much to be enjoyed out of the culture surrounding religion that can be divorced from the backwards ideology. And this is important to point out, because sometimes when people call themselves religious, they are identifying with these traditions rather than the abhorrent ideology. Religion as an ideology should not just be critiqued, it should be trashed. It is an immoral, irrational, and dangerous thing that has no place in the 21st century. However, religious people should never be subjected to such abuse, unless their physical actions have justified it. The problem with viewing believers as synonymous with their adopted ideology is that it's almost never the case. People follow the scripture to varying degrees. And honestly, very few people have even read it. When someone gives themselves the label Christian, Muslim, Jew, etc., it is easy to think they hold every belief their holy book describes, but this is simply not the case. Think about Christianity, for example. There are nearly 2 billion Christians throughout the world. How many of them know how to read? Due to the fact that many Christians live in developing nations without access to education, we can safely subtract tens of millions of people from this list. Then, out of those who can read, how many have read the Bible cover to cover? You can subtract hundreds of millions from this list. Then, how many have thoroughly read and understand the scripture they've been given? Subtract even more. Then how many understand the scripture and are disciplined enough to follow each dictate in the book with full confidence? It's almost no one. And this is true for Islam, Judaism, and any other religion as well. Religious people are not synonymous with religious ideas. They are not experts in the ideology they profess to believe, and oftentimes don't know the contents of the books they are advocating for. Most Christians that I've met don't even know that the Bible endorses slavery. They don't know it calls for the murder of homosexuals or the subjugation of women. Similarly, Most Jews fail to understand the genocidal history of the Abrahamic tradition as described in the Torah. Most Muslims don't know that the Quran calls for the death of non-believers repeatedly. There are many people ignorant of Scripture who simply use religion as a label for their own convictions. They feel they are part of a community. They like the traditions and enjoy the art. But they don't know the ideology, let alone follow it. So even though Christianity should be treated like a vile, intolerant belief system, it would be absurd to treat a Christian like a vile murderer in the making. The same can be said of Muslims. Even though Islam inspires terrorism throughout the world, it would be absurd to treat your average Muslim like a terrorist sympathizer. People are simply not synonymous with their professed ideology. And while the ideology must be attacked, its individual adherents must be respected unless their behavior violates the rights of others. We must also remember why we critique religion to begin with. The reason why we critique religion is because we want to stop people from believing in it. We want to persuade them to think critically. And anyone with even a cursory knowledge of persuasion knows that berating and ridiculing someone is not an effective strategy for changing minds. If someone feels as though they're being attacked, they usually double down on their beliefs. So acts of condescension, ridicule, and shaming of religious people is generally uncalled for in most contexts. I know the stereotype of the angry atheist is vastly exaggerated, but there is a grain of truth to it. Some people, who have experienced persecution growing up or are simply expressing outrage at the stupidity of the world, feel the need to lash out at believers in a way that is unhealthy to the discourse. There are also those like the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, who believe it is within their right to put religious minorities in concentration camps. The distinction between attacking ideas and attacking people is important to make if one's goal is genuinely the improvement of society. While it may feel good to vent one's frustration on those promoting harmful ideologies, make sure that you do not become a fundamentalist yourself. In ancient Rome, Christianity was a minority religion that was persecuted by the imperial authorities. Then, centuries later, when it became the majority religion, it punished and forcibly converted those it believed to be pagans. Today, atheists hold a minority worldview, but if trends continue, we will eventually become the majority. We have to make sure that in promoting secular forms of thought, we do not one day become ideologues for an intolerant materialist creed. When the Charlie Hebdo shootings occurred in Paris, there were both Orthodox Muslims and intolerant atheists who called for censorship of the magazine. They believed that offending the religious sensibilities of others should be prohibited, and thus wanted to make free expression a crime. This was a dark time in French history, when basic liberal principles were under attack. However, thankfully, there were others who resisted. A coalition of secular Muslims and tolerant atheists came together to oppose this illiberal force. Not only were the cartoons protected from censorship, they were widely shown across the internet. Acts of solidarity between different faith groups go to show that the struggle for progress in this world is not between theists and atheists. It's between those who believe in intellectual freedom and those who believe in orthodoxy backed by force. When it comes to basic moral character, those who believe in forcible conversion are not so different than those who believe in forcible deconversion. And when it comes to those who are curious and open-minded, they will learn to tolerate each other despite their different worldviews. If one is really going to persuade a believer, it must come from a place of respect. This does not mean respecting all of their ideas, but respecting their dignity as people. When conversation is rooted in a mutual feeling of shared interest, it is more likely to succeed. And so when trying to have these difficult conversations, I like to start with the following questions. How do you determine whether a claim is true? How do you determine whether an action is moral? The way a believer answers these questions will give important insight into the way they think. If they believe they are using reason to determine the factuality of claims, you can identify flaws in their reasoning which undermine their argument. If, however, they believe faith, intuition, and hearsay can be used as evidence, you will first have to show them why these ways of thinking are unreliable pathways to truth. Similarly, when it comes to making moral judgments, you will have to see how they think. If they use consequential impact to judge the morality of an action, you can use evidence to identify the harmful impacts of their beliefs. If, however, they believe in divine command theory, you will first have to show them why adherence to rules isn't an accurate indicator of morality. Until you can find some common ground on at least one of the two questions, it's going to be hard to make any progress. When a person doesn't respect evidence, presenting more evidence isn't going to help. And when a person doesn't view suffering as innately bad, pointing out the suffering their ideology causes isn't going to evoke moral revulsion. It's not hard usually to find believers who, at least in principle, are open to having their minds changed. The problem is making them discard something they have strong emotional attachments to. So let's look at this from the perspective of a theist. If we were to concede that both science and scripture are true, how would we go about reconciling this? First, we'd have to start by defining terms. Science is the study of the observable, a record of the measurable, a description of the physical. It is our best understanding of the universe as it is, and if a religious person believes that God created the universe, that means science is the study of His creation. When the fossil record points us towards an evolutionary history, this is because God has left it for us. When cosmic radiation suggests a Big Bang, it is because God has allowed us to see it. Scripture, on the other hand, is a series of religious stories written by humans. Theists believe them to be inspired by God, however most will accept that the authors are indeed beings of flesh and blood. If this is true, then the text itself is susceptible to error. Not only because the authors are imperfect, but because the editors and translators are imperfect as well. If we concede that man authored the scriptures and that God authored the cosmos, what does it mean when our observations about the cosmos come into conflict with scripture? Are we to trust the work of man or the work of God? Jesus himself was said to speak in parables. Why not other biblical authors as well? What if the supernatural events depicted in Christian mythology are merely metaphors made to communicate principles of moral virtue? Was there really a talking snake? Or was the snake character meant to symbolize the natural temptation which exists inside all of us? Did Jonah really live inside the belly of a whale? Or was the story meant to symbolize the city of Babylon, consuming the Jewish people? It is undoubtedly true that the biblical stories are meant to communicate important Hebrew values. The historical accuracy of these stories, however, is a different conversation. It is also worth pointing out that many of the tales in the Bible are eerily similar to the other mythologies popular in the countries surrounding ancient Israel. For example, when reading the Old Testament, one cannot help but notice the parallels between the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh and the tale of Noah's Ark. Similarly, it's hard to ignore the parallels between the fallen angel Satan and the Greek god known as Hades. Jesus was said to be the result of a miraculous birth, but so was the Egyptian god Horus and the Indian god Krishna. By demonstrating how religions borrow from each other's folklore, one begins to see the folly in taking any mythological story too literally. Once you can get a believer to admit that Scripture has inaccuracies, contradictions, or at least is meant to be read metaphorically, this provides wiggle room to plant the seeds of further doubt. It isn't easy to deconvert someone typically, and these personal journeys often take months if not years, but it can be accomplished. People's minds can be changed. And when they are changed, it is a wonderful thing to behold. Some believers will never abandon their faith in God, but they may be open to abandoning some of the other superstitious beliefs. Promoting a love of science and a sense of moral realism is important independent of the atheism question. And so anything that can drive a wedge between believers and fundamentalism should be applied with passion. Although these believers haven't abandoned God nor their scripture, they have abandoned most of their religion's outrageous beliefs. This is progress, even if it isn't complete deconversion. We have to accept the fact that most human beings on this earth are religious. Not only are they currently religious, but they have been for most of human history. These ideas and cultural practices will likely carry on for centuries into the future. However, if we can promote a more pacified version, their negative consequences can be mitigated. This is religious moderation, though many don't want to acknowledge it. And in a world of so much extremism, we could all use a little moderation. Conclusion. Imagine for a moment that you've just been checked into a hospital. Perhaps you fainted or started coughing up blood for some unknown reason. When the doctor comes in to do a number of tests on you, he discovers something horrifying. You're terminally ill. You have a fatal disease that has spread across your body, and now it is believed that you have only a few short weeks to live. In such a scenario, the doctor would have two choices. He could either tell you about your ailment, or he could lie to you and say everything is fine. Both of these decisions come with consequences, and they are ones he'd have to consider. If he tells you, you will have to deal with the anxiety and existential dread of knowing your death is coming. This will cause you pain and fear, and no doubt make it hard to sleep at night. There may be many moments where you burst into tears, and where your loved ones will have to see you in such a miserable state. In many ways, the short-term consequences of knowing the truth will be quite negative. But in other ways, they will be certainly positive. Never again would you waste a fleeting moment. With the understanding that your time is rare, you would be able to say your last goodbyes. You would be able to let your family and friends know you love them. And you would be able to settle old conflicts before it's too late. There is no guarantee you'd get everything you wanted in your last days, but you would at least cherish them. On the other hand, if you're lied to, you could go about the next few weeks blissfully unaware of your situation. You would continue to go to work, saving for a retirement that's never coming. You would continue to watch hours of mindless TV and stare at your phone rather than spending it with your loved ones. You would of course be happy in a sense. There would be no fear or pain or misery. However, the moment you die, it's done. There's no chance to say goodbye. There's no chance to formalize any last words. That last argument you had with your loved one will sit in their minds forever. Now let me ask you, the reader, this question. Which choice would you want the doctor to make? Would you have him give you the comfortable lie? Or the bitter truth? The goal of this book from the very beginning has been to make the point that picking the truth is worthwhile. For while most of us don't have cancer and have more than a few weeks to live, we are all in a situation that is just as terminal. As the late Christopher Hitchens told a crowd while he was dying of cancer, "I am dying, but so are you. Every single one of us is going to die. And by all the evidence we have, there is no afterlife." This means that religion is selling us the comfortable lie. It is denying the reality of our mortality and promising us an existence after our death. The goal of dispelling religion is not to make people live in fear or existential dread. The goal of dispelling religion is so that people don't take for granted their present lives. This has always been the goal of any secular spirituality or humanist movement. To love waking life. To live in the moment. And to celebrate the natural for all its gifts and wonders. Too often we live our lives worrying about the future or dwelling on the past. We take our loved ones' presence for granted because we believe we will see them again. Living in the now, and appreciating the real, is a way in which we enrich our lives by appealing to truth. And what is spirituality, but the pursuit of the truth? Is it not a way to feel connected to each other? To give thanks to the sources which have made our lives possible? The reason why I criticize religion so aggressively is because it gives us the wrong answers to life's most important questions. And when you think you have the answer to something, you more often than not quit looking. I for one think it matters what the basis of morality is. I think it matters what is true. I think finding one's purpose is a noble pursuit, and that learning to cope with mortality without lies is important. Don't wait until you're approaching death to answer life's most important questions. Consider them now. Consider what it means to live a truly fulfilled life. What is it that brings you meaning? Can you find a way in your life to achieve it? Also, are you living a moral life? Are you doing what you can to uplift the experience of your fellow creatures? If not, why? Do you think there is something else that constitutes good and bad? If so, what? And in terms of epistemology, are your beliefs consistent with the evidence around you? Are your arguments logically fallacious? Are you keeping your cognitive biases in check? These are all questions we must examine about ourselves if we are to live a good and worthwhile life. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and I truly believe that by examining these questions we become better thinkers and better people. Perhaps it may take you years to answer them. Perhaps even decades. Just know that there are indeed answers to these questions, even if some are entirely subjective to you. My hope is that after reading this book, people can step out their front doors and feel renewed purpose with every step they take. I want them to feel secure in this purpose, for they know that meaning is internally constructed and founded upon their own convictions. I also want them to be able to walk down the street and find themselves in appreciation of every little detail they encounter. To see the beauty in things, ranging from the architecture of buildings to the diversity of nature in their yards. I also want them to feel strong in their moral sensibility, to care about the well-being of others, and try to prevent that which would cause unnecessary suffering. We're all part of a community, and if we felt that connection, that sense of belonging amongst caring peers, people would no longer feel the sense of isolation which characterizes modern society. When you develop for yourself a form of secular spirituality, you will begin to feel this way. You will begin to find that life's most pressing questions do have answers, and even for those we have still yet to solve, sometimes the best answer is "I don't know." The admission of uncertainty is sometimes the bravest and most intellectually honest position to take. And that's okay. There is merit in unraveling mystery. There is awe to be found in exploration. Whether we're exploring the world scientifically with our instruments or experiencing it personally through our senses, the drive to understand existence is perhaps the most fulfilling endeavor. There is a great beyond out there, and I have no doubt that it contains untold wonders more grandiose than anything we can currently imagine. We may not know the ultimate answer to why we are here, if there is one, but we do have 13.7 billion years worth of evidence as to how we are here. This should be enough for us to understand who we are and what makes us happy. We do not need to appeal to superstition in order to feel wholesome and fulfilled. There is a vast cosmos worth exploring and an inner mind of consciousness worth expanding. So understand this: your life is precious. It has purpose. And it is worth living. What you decide to do with it is ultimately up to you. Yet if you want to answer life's most important questions, it will require you to think, and think a lot. A skeptical mind is one you'll need. So practice doubt when it comes to all perspectives, particularly your own. Be open-minded and observant, yet conscious of the fact that no one person can grasp it all. I cannot lie and say there isn't a comfort in having easy answers. Certainty is security. The unknown is dangerous. But any ideology, whether it be social, cultural, religious, political, or economic, that presents itself as an indisputable fact, is a dogma in the making. It should be criticized and challenged every time, lest we run the risk of mass indoctrination. The world needs more bold thinkers. More people willing to speak their minds in the face of social pressure. So stand up for what you believe in whenever the topic is contentious, for the more you do this, the more you'll realize you're not alone. And while you're at it, having this argument both externally with your peers and internally within, remember to enjoy yourself. Because life, first and foremost, is to be lived. Afterward, a place for the supernatural. While writing this book, a thought occurred to me which I haven't been able to overlook. What if my opponents are right? What if my strongly held beliefs are incorrect, and I've just spent a sizable chunk of life writing something untrue? The possibility of this is quite real, and so in anticipating this situation, I would like to state the following: it is not that I deny the existence of the supernatural. It is that I think our beliefs should be held in proportion to the evidence available. Since we have no evidence for the miraculous claims depicted in religion, it is right to urge non-belief. However, non-belief is not the same as the denial of possibility. If we are to be skeptical of all positions, and consistent with a critical view of the world, we must also be skeptical of naturalism, materialism, scientific methodology, and logic. Openness to possibility must be accounted for in our worldview. And though many of the claims held by the faithful are rightfully seen as nonsensical, we should continue to hear them with an open ear and a curious mind. The point of this book was not to strike any notion of a supernatural existence from the reader's thoughts. It was to show that we do not need such notions to live happy, fulfilling lives. Chapter by chapter, I have sought to explain how a secular materialist view of the world is compatible with our intimately held values. However, this does not mean that a secular materialist worldview is necessarily the correct one. For example, the point of Chapter 4 was not to say definitively that there is no conscious existence after death. The point was to say that we have no evidence of an afterlife, and that we do not need belief in an afterlife in order to cope our mortality. Similarly, the point of Chapter 7 was not to say definitely that the universe is devoid of objective purpose. The point was to say that we have no evidence of an objective purpose, and that a satisfying meaning can be internally constructed. When it comes to God in Chapter 10, I was not flat out denying the possibility of a supernatural entity being responsible for our lives. I am saying no such entity has been demonstrated to exist, nor is its existence necessary to answer life's most important questions. If there is to be one lesson drawn from this book, it should be the principle of skepticism and open-mindedness, outlined in the epistemology chapter. My wish is for people to be rational, not in agreement with my present religious and political beliefs. If you think there is merit to the religious worldview that I overlooked, then don't give it up. Don't give up on the idea there is something more than the physical natural world. Don't give up on the idea that there may be an existence after death or an otherworldly substance called a soul. Don't give up on the idea that there may have been a being who set the universe in motion. The only thing I must stress is that you acknowledge the lack of evidence for such claims and live your life accordingly. We should always be open to the possibility of supernatural existences, because there's a lot things we don't know. Whether it's the unexplained anomalies we've observed with our scientific instruments, or personal accounts we've been unable to verify, the human experience is filled with unsolved mysteries. I too sometimes wonder if my consciousness can be decoupled from my body, or if our lives have some hidden significance beyond that which we give it. I don't particularly stress over these questions because their likelihood is low, however I do think there is merit in hearing the arguments of their proponents. My parting words with you, dear reader, are to be humble. Keep listening, keep inquiring, and keep learning. Because the more we learn and explore, the closer we get to a satisfying answer.